She came to Red Hollow with a letter, a leather bag, and a brother she hadn't seen in 3 years. She left the train platform believing the worst was behind her. She was wrong. The man she crossed half a country to reach was already in the ground, dead 6 weeks before she arrived, and the town that buried him didn't even know she existed. No family, no money, no one waiting, just a door that had already closed before she ever raised her hand to knock. If you've ever arrived somewhere and realized the place you were counting on no longer exists, this story is for you. Hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled and follow along. Because what happens next will surprise you. The train pulled into Red Hollow just after noon on a Thursday in late September, and Clara Whitmore was the last person to step off. She had been awake for most of the 2-day journey from Kansas City, sitting upright in the third-class car with her leather bag pressed against her knees and her eyes fixed on the window as the country changed around her. Flatter, then rougher, then emptier, until the land looked like something that had given up trying to be pretty and just settled for being honest. She had eaten half a biscuit somewhere around midnight and told herself she wasn't hungry when she was. She had rehearsed the conversation she would have with her brother at least 30 times, rearranging the sentences, softening the parts where she would have to explain how bad things had gotten, deciding which details to leave out entirely. James Whitmore had always been the kind of man who didn't ask too many questions. That was one of the things she loved about him. She stepped onto the platform and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the brightness. Red Hollow was smaller than she'd imagined. A main street with maybe 15 buildings on each side, a water tower at the far end, a livery stable with a sagging roof, and a hotel with a painted sign that had faded so badly she could barely read it. The air smelled like dust and horse and something burnt, and the sky above the mountains to the west was the kind of deep blue that didn't look real. There were maybe a dozen people on the street. None of them were James. Clara waited on the platform for 20 minutes, watching the other passengers collect their things and disappear into the town. A man with a wagon full of grain. A woman in a green dress who was met by 2 children and a husband who kissed her on the cheek. A traveling salesman who adjusted his hat and walked toward the hotel with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly where he was going. Clara did not know where she was going. She picked up her bag and walked to the edge of the platform and looked up and down the street. Then she walked to the hotel because it was the only place she could think of to start. The man behind the desk had a thick mustache and the expression of someone who had been mildly disappointed by everything for a very long time. He looked up when she came in and took in her appearance in the efficient, unflattering way of someone who processed strangers for a living. "I'm looking for James Whitmore," Clara said. "He lives here, or near here. He's my brother. I was supposed to meet him today." The man's expression changed. Not much. Just a flicker of something that made her stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. "You said Whitmore?" "James Whitmore. He wrote to me in March." "I have the letter." She started to reach into her bag. The man held up a hand. "Ma'am," he said. Then he stopped. Then he started again. "James Whitmore passed about 6 weeks back. Fever took him fast. He was sick maybe 10 days before it was over. I'm sorry." "Did nobody write to you?" Clara stood very still. The noise of the street outside seemed to get louder, which didn't make any sense. Someone's horse clattered past. A door banged somewhere. She was aware of all of it in a detached, distant way, like she was listening through water. "Nobody wrote to me," she said. There wasn't much in the way of family here. He had a piece of land out east of town, but he owed some money on it, and I don't think anyone knew he had a sister coming." The man paused. "I truly am sorry, ma'am. It's a hard thing to hear." Clara thanked him, which she didn't fully understand why she did, and walked back out onto the street. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the hotel for what might have been 5 minutes or 30, and she tried to make her mind work the way it normally did, methodically, practically, one problem at a time. That was how she had always survived things, not by falling apart, by identifying the next step and taking it before the grief had a chance to catch up with her. But the steps weren't there this time. James was the only family she had left. Their parents had died within a year of each other when Clara was 22. She had spent the 4 years since then working in a boarding house in Kansas City, saving money, living carefully, waiting for circumstances to improve. When James's letter arrived describing the land he'd claimed in Colorado and suggesting she come west, she had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not just hope, but direction. A sense that the next chapter had finally appeared. She had given up her room. She had spent most of what she'd saved on the train ticket. She had packed everything she owned into one leather bag and told herself that this time, things were going to be different. The leather bag was sitting at her feet on the sidewalk. There were $11.40 in the small pocket sewn inside the lining. Clara sat down on the hotel steps, which she knew looked undignified and didn't particularly care, and she pressed her hands flat against her knees and stared at the dusty street and tried to figure out what came next. She was still sitting there when the boy appeared. He was maybe 8 or 9 years old, with brown hair that needed cutting and mud on both boots. And he had the particular fearlessness of children who have never fully learned that talking to strangers is inadvisable. He stopped directly in front of her with the unself-conscious directness of someone who hadn't yet figured out that staring was rude, and he looked at her face with genuine, uncomplicated curiosity. "Why do you look like you lost everything?" he asked. It was such a plain, honest question that Clara almost laughed. "Because I did," she said. The boy considered this. Everything, or just most things? "I'm still working that out." "My dad says the difference matters," the boy said seriously. "He says most things you can come back from. Everything is harder." "Your dad sounds like someone who's thought about it." "He has." The boy stuck out his hand with the formality of someone who had been taught manners and took them seriously. "I'm Eli Carter." Clara shook it. "Clara Whitmore." "That's a good name," Eli said, as though he were evaluating it. "Are you staying in town?" "I don't know yet." "Where else would you go?" She opened her mouth to answer and then closed it again because she didn't have one. "Eli." The voice came from behind her, and Clara turned to see a man standing about 10 feet away on the sidewalk. He was tall, not unusually so, but he carried himself like someone who was used to taking up space without apologizing for it. His clothes were working clothes, worn and clean, and his face had the particular texture of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. Weathered without being old, the lines around his eyes from squinting rather than age. He was looking at his son with an expression that was trying to be stern and wasn't quite succeeding. "Come away and stop bothering the lady." "She's not bothered," Eli said, with the serene confidence of a child who has decided he's right. "Eli." The boy looked at Clara. "Is it okay if I come back and talk to you later?" "I'll be here," Clara said, and then immediately wondered if that was true. The man walked over and put a hand on Eli's shoulder and looked at Clara with the cautious, assessing expression of someone who had learned to be careful about the assumptions he made. "I'm sorry if he bothered you, ma'am." "He didn't. He asked me a good question." Something shifted slightly in the man's face. "Nathan Carter," he said. He didn't offer his hand, which she noticed. "Clara Whitmore. I came to find my brother. He died 6 weeks ago, and I didn't know." She wasn't sure why she said it so plainly to a stranger. Maybe because she was too tired to soften it. Maybe because saying it out loud a second time made it feel slightly more real, and she needed it to be real before she could figure out what to do about it. Nathan Carter looked at her for a moment. His expression was difficult to read. Not unkind, but contained, like someone who had learned to keep his reaction somewhere private. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said. "Did you have a plan for after?" "I had a plan for arriving," Clara said. "I hadn't planned past that." He nodded, like this made a kind of sense to him. Then he said, "Come on, Eli," and they walked away down the street. Clara watched them go and then turned back to the street and told herself to think. The hotel was out of the question. $11 would last her maybe 4 days, if she was careful, and that was before she thought about food. James's land existed, apparently, but it had debts attached to it, and she had no idea who held those debts or what they amounted to. She had skills, cooking, sewing, managing a household, the kind of practical competencies that kept a home running, but skills needed someone willing to pay for them, and she had not yet established that anyone in Red Hollow was inclined to pay for anything she had to offer. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, picked up her bag, and started walking. She went to the general store first because it was the largest business on the street, and she figured if anyone needed help, a busy store might. The man behind the counter, whose name she later learned was Hatch, listened to her with the polite, impatient expression of someone doing her the courtesy of waiting until she finished talking before saying no. "I appreciate you asking," he said, "but I've got my wife helping, and it's not really the kind of work I'd hire out. You might try the restaurant." The restaurant was a low-ceilinged room with 4 tables and a smell of bacon grease that had soaked into the walls over many years. The woman who ran it was named Mrs. Pierce, and she was brisk and not unfriendly, but she shook her head before Clara had finished explaining herself. "I had a girl helping me until last month," Mrs. Pierce said. "Had to let her go. Couldn't afford the wages. Can't take on someone new. I'd work for less than standard." "Less than standard is still more than I've got." Mrs. Pierce looked at her with something that might have been sympathy. "You just arrived." "This afternoon. You have somewhere to stay?" "Not yet." Mrs. Pierce hesitated. "I can give you a meal," she said. "Today." "I can't promise more than that." Clara thanked her and said she would come back if she needed to, and kept walking. By 4 o'clock, she had been turned away from the general store, the restaurant, a seamstress shop, whose owner told her she was perfectly happy working alone, and the office of a man named Dobbins, who sold land and insurance and various other things, and who looked at Clara with the frank, unabashed assessment of a man deciding whether someone was worth his time, concluded she was not, and told her he had nothing available. She went back to the hotel steps. This time she didn't try to look like she was simply resting. She sat there because it was the only place she had, and she needed to think. And she had learned long ago that the best thing you could do when circumstances were genuinely bad was stop pretending they weren't. They were bad. She was in a town where she knew no one, with no income, no shelter after tonight, and enough money to survive about 4 days if she spent nothing unnecessary. Her brother was in the ground. The only future she had planned was no longer available. She was 26 years old, and she had started over twice before, and both times there had been something to hold on to. A room already arranged, a contact who could help, some thin thread of connection to the next step. There was no thread now. "You're still here?" She looked up. Nathan Carter was standing on the sidewalk, alone this time. He had a paper-wrapped package under one arm that looked like it might be supplies from the general store. "I said I would be," she said. "How'd you do?" "Nobody needs help they can pay for." He looked at the street for a moment, then back at her. "How long can you afford the hotel?" 3 days, maybe 4 if I skip some meals. "And after that?" "I'm still working on after that." He shifted the package under his arm. He looked like he was having some kind of internal argument and hadn't decided who was winning yet. "I'm going to pay for a few nights for you," he said finally. "Before you say anything, I'm not doing it out of charity. Consider it a loan if you need to. You can figure out a way to pay it back once you've found work." Clara looked at him steadily. "Why?" "Because you look like someone who'll find work," he said. "And because this town has a habit of deciding whether someone's going to make it before giving them a fair chance to show what they're capable of." It was more than she'd expected him to say. She thought about saying thank you, and then she thought about what he'd said. Consider it a loan. And she decided that was actually the right framework, the one she could accept without feeling like she'd been reduced to something she didn't want to be. "I'll repay you," she said. "Every cent." "I know." He said it without inflation, like it was simply a fact he'd already established to his own satisfaction. He went inside and spoke to the desk clerk, and when he came back out, he told her the room was paid for 5 nights. Then he nodded once and walked toward his wagon, which was hitched down the street. Clara stood and watched him go. Eli was in the wagon, sitting in the back with his legs dangling over the edge, and he waved at her with both hands when he saw her looking. She raised one hand in return. The boy grinned like she had done something wonderful. She spent the evening in the hotel room, sitting at the small table near the window with a piece of paper she'd borrowed from the desk clerk, writing down every skill she had in one column and every possible way to apply those skills in a town the size of Red Hollow in another column. The list of skills was reasonable. Cooking, competent, not exceptional. Sewing and clothing repair, genuinely good, better than average, she'd done enough of it at the boarding house to be fast and accurate. Laundering and household management, thorough, organized, reliable. Reading and writing. Better than most, she'd taught herself to keep accounts, and had handled the books for the boarding house owner for the last year. The list of applications was shorter and less encouraging. She crossed out the restaurant. Mrs. Pierce had been clear. She crossed out the seamstress. She left the general store with a question mark, thinking she could try Hatch again with a more specific offer. She wrote down laundry because she'd passed a hand-painted sign on a side street that said Whitfield's Laundry, and she didn't know enough about it to cross it off yet. She wrote down Nathan Carter's name and then looked at it for a moment and scratched a line through it, because that was a different kind of thing, and she wasn't ready to think about what kind yet. She folded the paper and put it in her bag and lay down on the bed without taking her boots off, and she thought about James. He had been 31 years old. He had been the kind of person who laughed easily and made everyone around him feel slightly more at ease with themselves, which was a rarer gift than most people recognized. He had written to her from Colorado with the genuine excitement of a man who believed he was building something. The letter had been full of details. The way the mountains looked in the morning, the particular quality of the light on the open land, the way the air tasted different at altitude. She had read it 4 times. She had never written back fast enough, and he had written twice more before she answered, and she had spent the last 2 days of the train journey composing apologies for that in her head, and now there was no one to give them to. She pressed her palms flat against her eyes for a moment, then took a breath, and then made herself stop. There would be time to grieve properly, later, after she had figured out how not to end up sleeping on the street. The next morning she was at Whitfield's Laundry by 7 o'clock. The place was run by a woman named Ada Whitfield, who was somewhere between 50 and 60, with arms like a farmhand and hair pulled back so severely that it looked like it might be causing her physical pain. She looked Clara over with the frank assessment of someone who was measuring her for usefulness, not judging her for sport. "You done laundry before?" Ada asked. "In a boarding house in Kansas City for 4 years. I can take in all the hotel linens and any of the ranch work in a day if the water's good." "Hotel linens are already mine," Ada said. "What I need is someone who can take the overflow. Ranchers bring things in, families in town bring things in. I've got more work than I can handle alone, and not enough money to pay proper wages." "What can you pay?" Ada named a number that was low, but not insulting. Clara countered with a number 10 cents higher, not because she needed to win the argument, but because she needed Ada to believe she meant business. Ada looked at her for a long, flat moment. "Fine," she said. "You start tomorrow, 6 in the morning." Clara shook her hand and walked back to the hotel, feeling something she hadn't felt since she stepped off the train. Not happiness, not relief, but something steadier than either one. A footing, something to push against. It wasn't much, but she had started from less before. Months. By the end of the first week, Ada had decided Clara was worth keeping. By the end of the second week, she had given her a small additional task, keeping the accounts, which Ada managed with an erratic system involving scraps of paper and memory and occasional arguments with herself, and the extra work came with a slightly larger sum at the end of the week. Clara paid Nathan Carter back the first installment on a Wednesday afternoon. She found him at the general store, which was apparently one of his regular stops, and she walked up to him directly and held out a folded bill and said, "Installment 1." He looked at the bill and then at her. "You didn't have to. I told you I would." He took the money. Something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it, like he had believed her when she'd said it, but hadn't quite prepared himself for what it would feel like to be proved right. "You found work," he said. "Whitfield's Laundry. It's not elegant. Not much in this town is." She almost smiled. "Your boy came by yesterday." His expression changed, quick, alert, the way parents looked when they weren't sure what they were about to hear. "Eli, what did he do?" "Nothing. He helped me carry a bundle of laundry down the street. He talked the entire time about a horse your ranch has, a gray one with a white patch that he says is the smartest horse on the property." "That's Marble," Nathan said. "She's averagely intelligent at best. He's attached to her." "He told me she knows her own name." "She knows the sound of the grain bucket. That's different." Clara did smile this time. "He's a good boy." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't have a lot of people to talk to. His sister's younger. Mara, she's 6. She's quieter. It's just the 2 of them." He stopped. "And me, obviously." "Obviously," Clara said, because she didn't know what else to say, and she could tell he hadn't planned to give her that much information and was now uncertain how to walk it back. She picked up her basket and said she had to get back, and he nodded, and she walked away thinking about what he'd said. It's just the two of them, and the specific, tired way he'd said it. Eli came by the laundry twice more that week. The second time, he brought his sister. Mara Carter was small for 6, with the same brown hair as her brother, but her father's contained, watchful eyes. She stood behind Eli's shoulder and looked at Clara from that position like someone deciding whether trust was safe before committing to it. Clara had seen that look on grown people. It was harder to see it on a 6-year-old. She didn't push. She talked to Eli about Marble the horse and asked him about what the ranch looked like, and let Mara listen from behind his shoulder and come to her own conclusions. After about 20 minutes, Mara came around from behind her brother and stood next to him and announced, without preamble, "I like your hair." "Thank you," Clara said. "Would you like me to braid yours?" Mara looked at her for a long, serious moment. Then she said, "Yes," and sat down on the step outside the laundry as though the matter was decided. Clara braided her hair. Mara sat very still and didn't say much, but she tilted her head slightly when Clara adjusted the braid, a small automatic gesture of trust, and when it was done she reached up and touched the top of her head with both hands, like she was confirming that it was real. "Can you do it again tomorrow?" Mara asked. "If you come by," Clara said. She didn't come the next day or the day after. She came 4 days later, and she had clearly been thinking about something the entire time, because when she sat down, she said immediately, without looking up, "Our mother died 2 years ago." "I know," Clara said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Eli says you lost everyone, too." Clara was quiet for a moment, threading the first piece of hair through her fingers. "I lost my brother. He was the last one I had." "Does it stop hurting?" "Different," Clara said after a moment. "I think it gets different." Mara thought about this. Different isn't the same as better. No, it isn't. Clara kept her hand steady, but different means it changes, and things that change can keep changing. Mara didn't say anything else for a while, but when Clara tied off the braid and stood back, the girl looked up at her with an expression that was the most open Clara had seen from her. Not quite a smile, but the careful, preliminary thing that came before one. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," Clara said, and meant it. Nathan found out his children had been visiting the laundry about a week after it started, when Eli mentioned it at dinner with the casual confidence of a child who saw no reason why it should be a problem. He sat with that information for 2 days before he did anything about it. Then he came into the laundry on a Saturday morning when Clara was wringing out a sheet and Ada was at the back, and the steam was heavy in the air, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "I want to apologize." Clara looked up. "For what?" "For sending my children to bother you without asking whether that was something you wanted. I said they were welcome. I know, but I want you to know I didn't send them. They went on their own." He paused. "Eli says you braided Mara's hair." "She asked me to." "She hasn't let anyone braid her hair since—" He stopped, then started again. "She used to let the neighbor woman do it. Stopped about 18 months ago. Wouldn't let anyone touch it." He looked at his hat. "I didn't know she'd let you." Clara wrung out the rest of the sheet. "She's careful about trust," she said. "She just needed to decide on her own terms." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "You seem to understand kids well. I looked after the children of some of the boarders, 4 years of it. Did you have siblings who were young?" "James was 5 years older than me. There wasn't anyone younger." She hung the sheet on the line. I remember what it was like to be that age and feel like the adults around you weren't actually paying attention to you. I try to pay attention." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I pay attention," he said finally. It sounded like something between a statement and a defense, and he seemed to hear that because he added, "I try to. It's harder when there's a ranch to run and it's just you." "I know," Clara said, and she did. She'd heard it in his voice since the first time he told her it was just the two of them. The particular exhaustion of someone trying to be enough for everyone and knowing, every single day, that they were coming up slightly short. She picked up the next piece of laundry and got back to work, and Nathan stood in the doorway for another moment and then put his hat back on and left. The second installment of the loan repayment went to Nathan 3 weeks after the first, this time in front of the hotel where she'd spotted him tying up his horse. He took it without comment this time, folded it into his pocket, and said, "How are you getting on?" "Better," she said. "Ada gave me more hours." "Town treating you all right?" The honest answer was, mostly not. The town had largely decided she was a temporary situation, a woman passing through who hadn't figured out yet that she was supposed to leave. People at the general store were polite in the distant, efficient way of people who didn't intend to learn your name. Mrs. Pierce at the restaurant still waved when she passed, which was something. But there was a general current of assumption that ran underneath every interaction. She was an outsider, she had no roots, and therefore her presence was a transient fact rather than a permanent one. "I'm managing," she said. Nathan looked at her sideways. "Hatch at the general store called you the woman from the hotel last week. You've been here 6 weeks. People take time. People in this town take longer than they should." It was, Clara thought, the most personal thing he had said to her, and it had come out of him easily, like he'd been thinking it for a while and the thought had simply worn through. "Why?" she asked. "For you?" He was quiet for a moment. "My wife was from Pennsylvania. They called her Nathan's wife for the first 4 years we were here." He paused. "After she died, they called her the woman who used to have that garden." Clara looked at him. He was watching the street. "She had a garden?" she asked. "Out by the east side of the ranch. She planted it the first spring after we arrived. Kept it every year." Stopped. "It's not much now. I let it go after she passed. I had other things to manage." "Of course you did," Clara said quietly. He looked at her then, and something in his expression was different from any of the previous times. Not the careful, assessed look he'd worn at the beginning, not the contained politeness of someone managing a conversation. Just a person looking at another person without particular armor. He looked tired. He looked like someone who had been carrying the same weight for so long he'd stopped noticing it was heavy and had only just remembered. "I should get going," he said. He untied his horse. "Nathan," she said, before she'd decided to. He paused. "Thank you," she said, "for the loan and for the other thing." She meant what he'd said about people taking too long, and she thought he knew it. He nodded once, mounted, and rode back toward the edge of town. Clara watched the horse disappear around the corner at the end of the street, and then she went back to the laundry, and she did not let herself think too long or too carefully about the way his expression had looked in that last moment before he turned away. She had too much work to do. And she had learned, over the years, that the things worth being careful about were exactly the ones that didn't feel like they needed caution. The thing about Red Hollow that Clara had not understood at first was that the town was not cruel. It was simply indifferent, which in some ways was harder to push against, because indifference didn't leave you anything to argue with. Cruelty had an edge. Indifference was just a wall with no door in it, and you could knock on it as long as you wanted, and nobody on the other side would be offended. They just wouldn't answer. She had been in town 7 weeks when she understood this clearly, and the understanding came not from a single moment, but from the accumulation of small ones. The way conversations at the general store stopped being about her and started simply not including her. The way women at the well nodded but never invited her into the circle of talk. The way the men who came into Whitfield's laundry with their ranch bundles handed things over the counter and collected their change and walked out without registering her as a person worth acknowledging in any particular way. She was furniture. Useful furniture. The kind you noticed when it wasn't there, but furniture nonetheless. Ada Whitfield noticed. Ada was not a woman who wasted much energy on sentimentality, but she was fair in the specific, practical way of someone who had been underestimated her own entire life and had decided to compensate by seeing people accurately. "Don't take it personally," Ada said one morning, feeding a shirt through the mangle with the rhythmic efficiency of someone who had done the same motion 10,000 times. "They did the same thing to me when I first opened. Figured a woman alone couldn't run a business. Took about 2 years before Hatch started actually talking to me instead of looking over my shoulder for whoever he assumed was really in charge." 2 years is a long time," Clara said. "Not really. Once it shifted all the way." Ada glanced at her. "You're doing the work. That's the part that matters." The rest of it catches up eventually. Clara appreciated the encouragement. She also knew Ada well enough by now to recognize that Ada's version of eventually was measured in seasons rather than weeks, and she didn't have that kind of time. She had paid Nathan Carter back 2 installments on the loan. She had $4 saved beyond what she needed for immediate expenses. She was keeping herself fed and housed. But the margin was thin enough that any disruption, illness, a slow week, Ada deciding she couldn't afford the extra hours, would tip her back into a situation that would be very difficult to recover from. She thought about this in the evenings when the laundry was closed, and she was back in the small room she'd taken above a widow named Mrs. Garland's house for less than the hotel cost. The room was narrow and the window faced north, so it was cold in the mornings, and the floor had a board near the door that creaked no matter how carefully you stepped over it. But it was hers in a way the hotel hadn't been, and she had put her few things on the shelf above the bed and arranged her bag under it and told herself this was enough for now. She was sitting at the small table near the cold window one evening, working through Ada's account books, which she had inherited as an unofficial duty because Ada trusted her arithmetic more than her own, when there was a knock at the door downstairs and voices, and then Mrs. Garland calling up the staircase. "Miss Whitmore, there's a boy here for you." Eli was standing at the bottom of the stairs with his hat in his hands and an expression that was working very hard to be casual and not quite succeeding. "My dad wanted to know if you'd come to supper Saturday," he said. "At the ranch." Clara looked at him. "Did your dad ask you to come say that, or did you decide to come on your own?" Eli's expression flickered. "He said it was a good idea." "Eli." The boy blew out a breath. "He said he was thinking about it. I told him it was a good idea and he should do it. Then he said fine. And then he kept not doing it, so I came myself." Clara felt something that was half exasperation and half something she didn't want to examine too closely. "Does your father know you're here?" "He knows I went out." "That's not quite the same thing." "He won't be mad." Eli said this with the confidence of a child who had calibrated exactly how far he could push his father and knew precisely where the line was. He just needed someone to actually say the thing. He's like that. He thinks about things for a long time and then doesn't do them. He looked up at her with those direct, earnest eyes. "Mara wants you to come. She told me to ask." "Did she?" "She said to tell you she saved a ribbon, the blue one. She wants you to use it when you braid her hair. She's been keeping it in her pocket for 3 days." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Saturday?" she said finally. "What time?" Eli's face opened up like a window. "Noon. I'll tell my dad." "Tell him I said he should have asked himself." Eli grinned. "I'll leave that part out." "Leave that part in," Clara said. "He should hear it." She spent most of Friday telling herself it was just a meal, which it was. A practical gesture from a man who had lent her money and whose children had attached themselves to her in ways that probably created a sense of social obligation. That was all. It was supper. People had supper. She borrowed an iron from Mrs. Garland and pressed her better dress and told herself to stop being an idiot about it. Nathan sent a wagon for her Saturday at 11:30, driven by a ranch hand named Pete, who had a sunburned neck and no particular interest in conversation, which suited Clara fine. The ride out to the Carter Ranch was about 40 minutes, through country that opened up slowly as they left town. Less crowded, the land stretching out flat in some places and rolling in others, the grass brownish gold in the October light. The ranch itself was larger than she'd imagined from the description. The main house was solid, not grand, but built by someone who intended it to last, with a wide covered porch and shutters that were weathered but intact. There were 2 barns, a bunkhouse, several outbuildings, and the skeleton of what might have been a garden on the east side of the house. A rectangular plot enclosed by a low split-rail fence, mostly overgrown now, with the dried remains of plants that had not been tended in a long time. She was looking at it when Nathan came out of the barn. He stopped when he saw where her gaze had gone, and something in his posture changed, a slight stiffening, a brief retreat. "The garden," she said, not as a question. "I should probably clear it out," he said. "Take the fence down. The land's not doing any good sitting like that. Or you could plant it again." He looked at her. "Takes a lot of work, a garden that size." "Most things worth keeping do." He seemed to not know what to do with that, and moved past it by asking her to come inside. The house was clean in the specific, functional way of a home maintained by someone who understood the importance of order but had stopped associating it with comfort. Everything was where it should be. Nothing was where it wanted to be. There were no particular touches that made it feel like a place people were happy in, only indications that people lived in it and kept it functioning. Mara was waiting in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing a blue ribbon tied at the end of her braid. She'd done it herself, imperfectly, the bow slightly lopsided. And when she saw Clara come in, she stepped forward with the deliberate, dignified movement of a child who had decided this was an important occasion and was conducting herself accordingly. "I saved the ribbon," she said. "I can see that," Clara said. "You put it in yourself?" "I tried." Mara touched the lopsided bow. "It's not right." "May I fix it?" Mara turned around without another word, the way children did when they decided yes and saw no need to say it out loud. Clara knelt down and untied the ribbon and rebraided the last section and tied a proper bow, and Mara reached up and touched it and nodded as though the matter was now officially concluded. Eli appeared from the back of the house, still pulling on his second boot. "Is it noon yet?" "Close enough," Nathan said. He looked at Clara. "I hope you eat well. The cook's not... I do the cooking. I'm not exceptional at it." "What did you make?" "Stew and biscuits. The biscuits are from yesterday, but I'll warm them." "Stew and warmed biscuits is a meal," Clara said. "Don't apologize for it." He looked at her for a moment, and then something in him seemed to relax slightly. Not all the way. Just enough to take the edge off the formality he'd been carrying since she arrived. They sat at the kitchen table, all four of them, and it was not a comfortable meal exactly. There was too much that nobody said, too many pauses where conversation ran into something and stopped and had to find another direction, but it was a real meal, the kind that felt lived in rather than performed. The stew was decent. The biscuits were a little dry. Eli talked almost continuously about Marble the horse, who had apparently developed an opinion about which ranch hands she preferred, and expressed this opinion through selective cooperation. Mara ate carefully and listened, and occasionally corrected Eli when his version of events differed from hers. "She didn't kick Pete," Mara said. "She moved like she was going to." "That's different." "It's Marble," Eli said. "You have to understand her intentions." Nathan looked at Clara across the table with an expression that was, for just a moment, openly, tiredly amused. It lasted maybe 2 seconds before he collected himself. "She's a good horse," he said. "Mostly." After the meal, while the children went outside, Nathan poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table in front of Clara without asking whether she wanted it, which she noted with something between appreciation and amusement. He sat down across from her and wrapped his hands around his own cup and looked at the table for a moment like he was organizing something. "I want to say something," he said. "All right." "About the loan. You don't have to repay it so fast. I said loan because I figured you'd be more comfortable with that framing, but I wasn't. I didn't do it expecting to see it back." Clara looked at him steadily. "I know that. I'm paying it back anyway." "I know, He stopped, started again. "Eli told me he came to your room Friday night without me knowing. He told me to leave that part in when I gave you the message." Nathan exhaled. "I bet he did." He rubbed the side of his jaw. "I was going to ask you. I just wasn't sure if it was appropriate. My situation is that I work at a laundry and I live above a widow's house and I eat supper alone 6 nights a week," Clara said. "A meal at a ranch is not going to compromise me socially." He looked at her. "That's not what I meant." "What did you mean?" He was quiet for a moment. "I meant I wasn't sure whether having you out here was appropriate for you, given what people say about widowers with children and women who are..." He stopped. He seemed genuinely frustrated with himself, the way people got when they were trying to say something considerate and it kept coming out sideways. "Women who are what?" Clara said. Not challenging, just asking. "Women who are in uncertain positions," he said finally. "I didn't want to imply something that would make things harder for you, with the town." Clara thought about this. It was, she realized, actually a considerate thing to have been worried about, even if the delivery had been awkward. The town had already formed its opinion of her, and an association with a widower would be read a specific way, either as an attempt to secure herself or as something more scandalous, depending on the inclinations of whoever was doing the reading. I appreciate that, she said, but the town already thinks whatever it's going to think about me. I'd rather have a hot meal and let them think it. Nathan almost smiled. It was the second time she'd seen him get close to one, and like the first time it happened briefly, like a window opening and then being pulled shut before you could really see inside. Fair enough, he said. They drank their coffee. Outside, through the window, she could see Eli running across the yard toward the barn, and Mara following him at the more measured pace of a child who had decided running was beneath her current level of dignity. Your ranch hand, Clara said after a while. Pete. What about him? He drove me out here without saying a word the entire way. Not unfriendly, just very quiet. Pete's all right. He's been with me 4 years, just doesn't see much point in talking unless there's something that needs saying. Does that bother you? No. Nathan looked at his cup. Most people talk too much in my experience, say a lot of things that don't mean what they're trying to mean. And what are you trying to mean? Clara asked. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out level and direct, the way things came out when she was too tired to manage the careful indirection that social convention usually required. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. I'm trying to say I'm glad you came out, he said, and I'm bad at saying that without it sounding like something else. It sounds like what it is, Clara said. That's fine. The walk back through the ranch before Pete drove her home took them past the abandoned garden because Clara had positioned herself toward it without quite planning to, and Nathan had followed without comment. They stood on the outside of the low fence and looked at it, the dry, matted remains of what had been, the volunteer weeds that had moved in when the tending stopped, the fence itself, which was low and sound and would only need minor repair. What did she grow? Clara asked. Beans, tomatoes, some herbs. She was particular about the herbs. Lavender, she had, along the south edge. It came back wild for a year after she stopped, but I think it's gone now. He looked at the corner where the lavender would have been. She grew things she could use. She wasn't sentimental about it, but she liked it out here, liked having a reason to be outside in the morning. What was her name? He glanced at her, a quick, slightly startled look, as though the question had come from an unexpected direction. Eleanor, he said. Ellie, mostly. Clara nodded. She looked at the garden another moment. The soil looks like it could still grow things, she said. It's been left, but it hasn't been ruined. It hasn't been touched in 2 years. Plants come back from worse than neglect. She looked at him. If you ever wanted to put it back in. He was quiet for a beat. You'd know about that? Gardening? Enough, my mother kept one. She paused. James had a piece of land he was going to grow things on. He wrote to me about it, what he was going to plant. She stopped there. She had not meant to say any of that. It had come out because she was standing in front of a neglected garden, talking about things that grew back, and the connections between thoughts were closer to the surface than usual. Nathan didn't say anything immediately, which was the right thing to do. He just stood beside her and let the silence be what it was. I'm sorry about your brother, he said finally. I didn't say it right the first time. I said the words, but I didn't. I'm sorry. You said them fine, Clara said. You didn't know me. I know you a little better now. She looked at the garden. He would have liked it out here, she said. He liked space. He wrote about how much sky there was. Oh, she exhaled. He wasn't wrong about that. Above them, the Colorado sky was doing what it did in October spring, going wide and deep and particular in a way that she still wasn't used to, even after 2 months, the blue so saturated it looked like it was trying to mean something. Pete appeared around the side of the barn with the wagon, punctual in the wordless way that seemed to be his personal philosophy. I'll walk you out, Nathan said. At the wagon, Eli appeared from nowhere, as he tended to, and shook Clara's hand with the same formal seriousness he'd used the first time, except now there was a grin underneath it. Mara was more restrained. She stood a little back, her blue ribbon firmly in place, and when Clara said goodbye, she said very quietly, You can come again. It was not a question or an invitation. It was a statement of fact. The way a 6-year-old said the thing she most needed to be true. I'll come again, Clara said. Mara nodded, satisfied, and walked back to the house. The week after the ranch visit, Red Hollow did something Clara hadn't expected. It noticed her, not warmly, not suddenly, but something had shifted in small ways. The way Mrs. Pierce stopped her outside the restaurant one morning to ask how she was getting on, the way Hatch at the general store actually learned her name and used it, the way a woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran the town's informal sewing circle, stopped her on the street and said they were meeting Thursday and she was welcome if she wanted to come. Clara went to the sewing circle. It was 6 women around a table in Ruth's parlor, doing the kind of handwork that didn't require much concentration and therefore left the mind free for conversation. The conversation was mostly about the town, who had done what the weather was likely to do, whose cattle had gotten into whose fence. Clara listened and repaired the hem on a shirt she'd brought from the laundry and didn't say much, but she didn't need to. Being present was the thing. Being someone who showed up and was not strange and not threatening and had opinions about thread counts, that was sufficient. On the way out, Ruth put a hand briefly on her arm and said, "Nathan Carter's a decent man." Clara looked at her. "I saw you out on the road from his ranch 2 Saturdays ago," Ruth said, without any particular inflection. Pete was driving. His children were on the porch. "He invited me for a meal," Clara said. "His children had been coming by the laundry." "I know. Ada told me." Ruth studied her with the particular attention of a woman who had been watching people for 60 years and felt she'd developed some accuracy at it. "He hasn't had anyone out to the ranch since Eleanor passed. That's 2 years." "I know," Clara said. "Just making sure you knew," Ruth said, and left it there. The third repayment to Nathan happened on a weekday when she hadn't expected to see him, and it came in the middle of an argument. She had gone to the land office to ask, finally, about James's claim, because she'd been putting it off, telling herself she needed to be more settled before she could deal with it, and finally recognized that she was using that excuse to avoid something that scared her. The man at the land office was a small, bristling man named Aldous Crane, who wore glasses on a chain and managed to radiate impatience without moving any particular part of his face. He informed Clara, in the tone of someone explaining arithmetic to a slow child, that James Whitmore's claim had debts outstanding to 2 parties, that without payment those debts transferred with the claim, that Clara as next of kin could theoretically inherit the land and the debt together, and that in his professional assessment the land was not worth the debt. "What is the land worth?" Clara asked. "The parcel? Maybe $100. The debt is $140. Who holds the debt?" "One note is held by the previous owner of the general store, old Bram Hatch, Hatch's father, who sold the parcel to your brother. The other note is held by Caleb Mercer." Clara wrote both names down. "And if I don't claim the land, then it reverts to the territory, and the debt dies with it. Your brother had no other assets." Crane looked at her over his glasses. "Most people in your position would let it go." "I'll think about it," Clara said. She was standing outside the land office going through what Crane had said when Nathan walked up. He had apparently been in town for supply pickup and had seen her coming out of the land office and, being Nathan Carter, had waited rather than pretending he hadn't seen her. "James's land," she said, before he could ask. "I know the parcel," he said. "East of town, small. Your brother had it about 8 months before he died. There's debt on it, more than it's worth." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Are you thinking about claiming it?" "I'm thinking about the fact that I shouldn't want to, and I do anyway." She exhaled. "It's the last thing James had. The last thing that was his." She shook her head. "Which is a terrible reason to take on debt I can't pay." "Not terrible," Nathan said, "but maybe not the right reason either." What would be the right reason? He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't deflect or give her the comfortable answer. If the land could eventually pay for itself, if you had a way to make it worth more than the debt over time. "I'm a laundry worker." "You're a person with a good head," he said. "That's not the same as being limited to what you're doing right now." Clara looked at him. "Do you know Caleb Mercer?" Something in Nathan's expression changed, a small, controlled shift. "I know who he is. Crane said he holds one of the notes on the land." "I know." He said it flatly, which told her there was more underneath it. "Mercer holds notes on a lot of things in this town. He's been buying up debt for the last 3 years. Land that goes delinquent, claims that get abandoned." He paused. "He's patient. He doesn't push. He just waits. What does he do with it? Consolidates. He's got about 12 parcels east of town now, all acquired through debt or low purchase. Nobody's sure what he plans yet. Nathan looked up the street. He's been waiting for the Carter Ranch to hit a bad year too. We've had 2 rough ones. I'm still standing, but he's patient. Clara absorbed this. So James's land is just another piece he's waiting to absorb. Most likely. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much do I owe you?" "What?" "On the loan, how much is left?" He calculated without reaching for paper. $12. She reached into her bag. She had $11.40. She'd counted it that morning, and she gave it to him. He looked at the bills and coins in his hand. "It's not the full 12, she said. "I'll get you the 60 cents by end of week." "Clara, don't," she said, not unkindly. "I need to have done it, so let me have done it." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him deciding whether to argue and concluding that she meant exactly what she'd said. "End of week," he said. "End of week." He folded the money into his pocket. Then he said carefully, "You should go talk to Mercer before you decide anything about the land. You should at least know what he's like." "You're not going to tell me what he's like?" "I'm going to let you form your own opinion. You're better at people than I am." "You don't know that." "I've watched you handle everyone in this town for 2 months, Nathan said. "I know that." It was a plain thing to say, the kind of thing that arrived without decoration and stayed because of it. Clara picked up her bag. "I'll go see him," she said. She walked back toward the laundry, and behind her she heard Nathan say quietly, in the particular way of someone not entirely sure they wanted to be heard, "Let me know what he says." She didn't turn around, but she was going to let him know. Ada was in the back of the laundry running a load through when Clara came in, and she looked up and read something in Clara's face with the accuracy of someone who had spent years reading people over a counter. "Land office?" Ada asked. "How did you know?" "Ruth told me you'd been putting it off. Figured you'd get around to it eventually." Ada went back to her work. "What did Crane say?" Clara told her. Ada was quiet for a while, working with the efficient, unhurried movements of someone who thought better with her hands occupied. Then she said, "Mercer came by here once, 3 months after I opened. Offered to buy me out. Said a laundry run by a woman alone was a risk, and he could give me a fair price." "What did you tell him?" "I told him to leave." Ada wrung out a shirt with more force than strictly necessary. "He was polite about it. That's the thing with him. He's always polite. Makes you feel like you're the one being unreasonable." She glanced at Clara. "He's going to make you an offer. When you go see him, he'll frame it as a kindness." "What do I say?" "You say you'll think about it," Ada said, "and then you come back here and think about whether there's another way." She folded the shirt with a crisp snap. "There's usually another way, if you're willing to do the work." But Clara tied on her apron and got back to the pile of waiting laundry, and she thought about patience, the kind Mercer had, waiting for things to fall to him, and the different kind she was trying to build, the kind that was less about waiting and more about holding on so long that eventually the thing you were holding became yours, not by luck, but by sheer refusal to let go. The 2 kinds looked similar from the outside. They were not the same thing at all. Caleb Mercer's office was on the north end of Main Street, in a building that was newer than most of the others and better maintained. The paint fresh, the sign professionally lettered, the windows clean in a way that suggested someone paid particular attention to appearances. Clara stood outside it for a moment before going in, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to be clear in her own mind about what she was going in for. She was going in to gather information. She was not going in to decide anything. She pushed the door open. The office inside was warm and ordered. A desk with papers arranged in precise stacks, a bookshelf with ledgers lined up by size, 2 chairs positioned across from the desk at exactly the same angle. Behind the desk, Caleb Mercer stood up when she entered, which she noted. He stood up, which was either manners or calculation or both. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, a compact, well-dressed man with dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of face that had probably always looked reasonable. Not handsome exactly, but arranged in a way that inspired confidence, the way some faces did. He looked like the kind of man who was always the most composed person in any room, and who knew it. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I was wondering when you'd come." Clara sat down without being invited to, which she did deliberately. "You knew I would? I heard you'd been to the land office." He sat back down, smooth and unhurried. "Word travels in a town this size. I hope you'll forgive me for being direct. I've been expecting you since I heard James Whitmore had a sister arriving. You knew about me before I got here? I knew your brother had written to Kansas City. I make it my business to know what's happening with properties I hold notes on." He said it without apology, as a simple statement of practice. "I'm sorry about your brother, Miss Whitmore. He was a decent man. Not a practical one, perhaps, but decent." "What does that mean? Not practical?" "It means he bought land he couldn't afford with money he didn't entirely have, in the belief that things would work out." Mercer folded his hands on the desk. "They usually don't work out the way people believe they will. That's not a criticism of your brother, it's an observation about optimism." Clara looked at him. "I assume you have an offer." He smiled, a professional smile, pleasant and controlled. "I'd like to relieve you of the debt. The note I hold is $80. I won't ask you to repay it. In exchange, you sign over the claim, and the land comes to me, and you're free of it entirely. The other note, the Hatch one, $60. I can likely absorb as part of the same arrangement." He paused. "You walk away clean, no debt, no obligation. Given your current situation, that seems like the sensible outcome." "My current situation," Claire repeated. "You're working at Ada Whitfield's laundry. You have a room above Margaret Garland's house. You've been here 2 months and you've managed to establish yourself, which I respect. Not everyone could have done that in your circumstances." He said all of this without condescension, which was somehow more unsettling than if he'd been obviously contemptuous. "But you're not in a position to service that debt, and the land in its current state isn't in a position to generate income. There's no path where you come out ahead by holding on, unless the land becomes worth more than the debt." "In what scenario does that happen?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why I haven't decided." Mercer studied her for a moment. The professional smile faded slightly. Not into unfriendliness, just into something more honest. "You're more stubborn than I expected," he said. "That's not an insult." "I didn't take it as one." "Let me ask you something." He leaned forward slightly. "What would you do with the land if you kept it? Practically. What is the plan?" Clara met his eyes. "I'm still forming it." "Take your time," he said. "The offer stands. I'm not going anywhere, and neither is the debt." He rose as she did, mannerly to the end. "I'll say this. You remind me of Ada Whitfield when she first came here. She turned down a fair offer, too. It's worked out for her." He paused. "It doesn't always work out." Clara nodded once and left. She stood on the sidewalk outside Mercer's office in the November cold and breathed the air and tried to think clearly. The offer was genuinely reasonable. That was the most unsettling thing about it. He was not wrong that she had no practical plan. He was not wrong that the debt was larger than the land's current value. He was not wrong that her position was fragile. He was right about almost everything he'd said. And yet, she thought about what Nathan had told her, that Mercer was patient, that he'd been accumulating parcels east of town for 3 years, that nobody was sure what he planned. She thought about Ada's words. There's usually another way, if you're willing to do the work. She walked back to the laundry, and she thought about James, who had been not practical but decent, and who had believed things would work out, and who had been wrong about the timing but not, perhaps, wrong about the land. She told Nathan about the meeting that Saturday when she came out to the ranch for what had become, without anyone formally naming it, a weekly visit. It was November now and colder, and the children had moved their afternoon activity inside. Eli teaching Mara a card game whose rules he was adjusting in real time to favor himself, with a lack of subtlety that Mara was only just beginning to detect. Clara and Nathan were at the kitchen table with coffee, which had become its own ritual. The after-meal coffee where the children drifted away and the two of them sat and talked, not about anything that required particular courage, but in the easy building way of two people who were learning each other's conversational rhythms. When she told him about Mercer's offer, Nathan listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd come to appreciate about him. He was reasonable, she said. He made good points. He usually does, Nathan said. You sound like you've had your own version of that conversation. 2 years ago, year after Eleanor died, I had a rough cattle season and he came and made a very reasonable offer on the east 40 acres of the ranch. Nathan turned his coffee cup in his hands. He wasn't wrong that the money would have helped. He wasn't wrong that the acreage wasn't performing. He said all the right things in the right order. But you said no. I said no. He looked at the table. Because I realized partway through the conversation that he already knew he was going to get it one way or another. He was just deciding whether it was now or later. And when someone's already decided you're going to lose, the right thing to do is make their certainty as expensive for them as possible. Clara looked at him for a moment. Did it work? The East 40 is still mine. He almost smiled. It had a decent year last spring. Not exceptional, but decent. So stubbornness paid off. Stubbornness and one good growing season and Pete working 16-hour days for 3 months, he paused. It's not always the thing that saves you. Sometimes you're stubborn and you just lose slower. But you do it the same way again. He thought about it. Genuinely thought, not the way people did when they'd already made up their mind. Yeah, he said. I do it the same way, because at least then the decision was mine. Clara nodded slowly. Outside, through the kitchen window, the light was going thin and pale across the yard, the way November light did in the late afternoon. The kind of light that made everything look clean and a little lonely. I want to know what he's planning, she said. With all those parcels east of town, James's land is right in the middle of that cluster. I know. If there's something he sees in that land that makes it worth accumulating, that's information that matters before I decide anything. Nathan was quiet for a moment. There's been talk, he said slowly, like he was deciding how much to say, about a railroad spur. Nothing official, nothing confirmed, but there's been survey crews out east of town twice in the last year, and the route they'd be looking at would run straight through that parcel cluster. Clara set her cup down. A railroad spur to Red Hollow, she said. If it happens, land in that corridor goes from marginal to valuable overnight. He met her eyes. Mercer's been buying for 3 years. He's not patient because he likes waiting. He's patient because he knows something most people don't. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Or suspects something, she said. There's a difference. Survey crews mean possibility, not certainty. True. But it's enough to change the calculation. It changes the question, at least, Nathan said, from whether the land is worth holding to whether you're willing to hold it on the chance it becomes valuable enough to matter. Which comes back to whether I can service the debt in the meantime without it breaking me. Yes. She sat with that. The card game in the other room had devolved. She could hear Mara's voice going flat with outrage and Eli's defensive explanation getting faster, which was what happened when he knew he'd been caught at something. You cheated, Mara said, very clearly in the next room. I adjusted the rules to make it more interesting. That's cheating. It's strategy. Eli, Nathan raised his voice just enough to carry. Give her back whatever you took. Silence. Then the sound of cards being reluctantly redistributed. Clara looked at Nathan, and this time neither of them held the almost smile back quite far enough. He's going to be trouble when he's older, she said. He's trouble now, Nathan said. He just hasn't found the bigger applications yet. The almost smile faded into something quieter. He likes you a lot, both of them do. I like them. I know. He turned the coffee cup again. I want you to know that whatever you decide about the land, about Mercer, about any of it, you have someone in your corner. I'm not saying that to be something. I'm just saying it because it's true, and I don't think you've had a lot of people say it to you recently. Clara looked at him for a moment. She felt the thing she always felt when he said something unexpectedly direct, a quick, involuntary softening that she immediately compensated for with practicality, because that was the way she had learned to manage herself. Thank you, she said, and meant it simply, without loading it with anything more complicated. December arrived and brought with it a cold that was more serious than November's, the kind that came down off the mountains in the night and was still there in the afternoon, settling into the bones of the town with the comfortable permanence of something that had no intention of leaving soon. The laundry was harder in the cold. Hands that were already rough from the work got worse. Water that wasn't hot enough didn't clean properly, and water that was too hot turned your skin raw. Ada had developed a system over the years, and Clara learned it the way she learned everything Ada taught her, by watching carefully and adapting quickly and not pretending she'd understood something when she hadn't. "You've got good hands for this work," Ada told her one morning, which was the closest Ada came to a compliment. "Most people get clumsy when it's cold. You get more precise." "I don't like making mistakes I have to redo," Clara said. "Nobody does. Most people do them anyway." Ada handed her end of a sheet. "I've been thinking about taking on the Mercer household account. His housekeeper left in October and he hasn't replaced her. He's been sending things to us one piece at a time, which is inefficient." Clara kept her face neutral. "How much is the account worth?" Ada named a number that was significant. The Mercer household ran to a lot of table linens and formal shirts. "Do you want me to stay off that account?" Clara asked. "Given the land situation," Ada looked at her. "No, I want you to handle it. You're the best I've got at the shirts, and business is business." She paused. "But you should know he'll probably come in himself to discuss it. He doesn't send people when he wants something handled a certain way." Mercer came in the following Thursday. He handed over a bundle of shirts and stood at the counter with his hat in his hand and looked at Clara with the expression of a man acknowledging something he found mildly interesting. "You're still here," he said. "I live here now," Clara said. "Will you want these back by Monday?" "Monday is fine." He didn't move toward the door. "Have you thought more about the land?" "I think about it every day." And I haven't decided yet." He studied her for a moment. "I've made some inquiries," he said, "about your situation, about what you know and what you're considering." He said it without embarrassment, the kind of man who was open about the information he gathered because he'd decided that transparency about his methods was less dangerous than being caught at them. "I think you've heard about the survey crews." Clara kept her hands busy with the counter. "Have you?" "I told you, word travels." He looked at her with something that was, she thought, genuine respect of a particular kind, the kind someone felt for an adversary they hadn't expected to have. "The survey is real. The spur is not guaranteed. There are 2 other routes under consideration, and this one requires significant bridge work over the creek east of the parcel cluster. It may not be the one they choose, but it might be. It might be." He turned his hat in his hands. "Here's what I'll tell you, because I prefer straight dealings. If it is the one they choose, your brother's parcel is worth 5 times what it is now, maybe more, and you'd be the one who benefited." "But," he paused. "But if it isn't the one, and there's maybe a 40% chance it isn't, you've been carrying debt on a piece of marginal land for however many years it takes to find out, and then you still have to decide what to do with it." Clara looked at him. "You're trying to talk me into the deal." "I'm trying to be honest with you about the risks on both sides," Mercer said. "I don't need to talk you into it. Time does that work for me. Debt gets heavier. Patience has a cost." He put his hat back on. "Monday for the shirts. I appreciate you handling them yourself. The last laundry I used put creases in the wrong places." He left with the same smooth composure he'd arrived with. Clara stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed, and she thought about 40%. The chance the spur didn't come through. And she thought about what Nathan had said, about Mercer being patient because he knew something. And she thought that knowing something and knowing everything were 2 different things, and that Mercer, for all his composure and preparation, was also making a bet. He was just better positioned to absorb a loss than she was. That was the whole of his advantage, really, not that he was smarter or that he had better information, just that he could afford to be wrong. She picked up the bundle of shirts and got back to work. Nathan came into town the 2nd week of December with Eli and Mara, which was less common than his solo trips. Usually the children stayed at the ranch with Pete's wife, Dora, who looked after them on supply days. But this was a different kind of trip. It was the week before Christmas, and Nathan had apparently made a promise about a trip to the general store that he was honoring with the resigned expression of a man who was about to spend money he hadn't entirely planned to spend. Clara saw them from the laundry window, Mara holding Nathan's hand with both of hers, looking at the decorated shop fronts with the concentrated attention of a child extracting maximum sensory information from an experience, and Eli 3 steps ahead and 4 steps to the side. As Eli always was in public, his attention distributed across everything at once. She went out, and they stopped. Shopping trip, Nathan said by way of explanation. I gathered. She looked down at Mara. Have you been to town before for Christmas? Mara thought about it seriously. Once, she said, when Mama was here. I was 4. I don't remember it exactly, but I remember there was a smell. Pine, Nathan said quietly. Hatch had pine boughs in the store. He has them again this year, Clara said. I passed this morning. Mara looked at the general store, which was down the street. I want to go see, she said with quiet urgency. We'll go, Nathan said. He looked at Clara. Do you have time? She looked back at the laundry. Ada was in the back. The front pile was manageable. A few minutes, she said. They walked down to the general store, the 4 of them, and it was such a plain and unremarkable thing, walking down the main street of a small Colorado town a week before Christmas with a man and his 2 children, that Clara caught herself not thinking about it, which was how she knew it had become comfortable. The things that were comfortable stopped requiring attention to maintain. Inside, Mara found the pine boughs and stood under them with her eyes closed for a moment, breathing deliberately, like she was committing something to memory. Eli discovered a display of penny candy and began the negotiation process with his father that he had clearly been planning since they left the ranch. 3 things, Nathan said, before Eli could open his mouth. Eli recalibrated. 5. 3. 4 and I helped Pete with the fence line without complaining. Nathan looked at him for a long moment. You were going to help with the fence line anyway. But I wasn't going to do it without complaining. Clara turned away so neither of them could see her face. She studied a bolt of blue fabric on the counter with more attention than it strictly deserved until she heard Nathan say, flatly, 4, and Eli's sound of satisfaction. Mara appeared at Clara's elbow. What is that color called? She asked, looking at the fabric. Indigo, Clara said. It's a kind of blue. It's the same color as the sky when it gets dark, but isn't dark yet, Mara said. That's exactly right, Clara said. That's a good way to describe it. Mara considered this, then looked up at her with the particular expression she had, the careful, measuring look, and said, Are you going to stay in Red Hollow? Clara looked at her. That's a serious question. I want to know. I'm planning on it, Clara said. Mara looked at the indigo fabric for another moment. Good, she said, and moved away toward the pine boughs again. Nathan's offer came on the last Saturday before Christmas. She had not expected it, and she suspected he had not fully planned the moment. It had the feeling of something that had been building to a point where it became unavoidable, like water finally finding the lowest place. The children were outside with Pete's daughter, who had come along this week, and Clara and Nathan were in the kitchen, and there was coffee as there always was, and the house was quieter than usual. The particular quiet of a winter afternoon in a place where you could hear the wind when it moved. Nathan had been less conversational than usual. She'd noticed it, but hadn't pushed. She knew him well enough now to know that when he got quiet, it meant something was moving through him that hadn't finished arriving yet. He set his cup down. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to know that however you answer it, nothing changes between us. With the children, with Saturday visits, with any of it. I'm not using any of it to make you feel like you have to answer a certain way. Clara set her own cup down. All right. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. I want you to consider coming here, to the ranch, permanently. He said it plainly, without ornament, in the voice he used when he decided something deserved to be said straight. Not as hired help, not because I need someone to manage things, though you'd be good at it, because I think you belong here, and I think maybe you've started to feel that too, and I didn't want to wait any longer to say it out loud. Clara looked at him. He was watching her with the expression she'd seen only a handful of times, the one without the armor, where the tiredness and the care and the particular loneliness of the last 2 years all sat on the surface at once. Are you asking me to marry you? She said. I'm asking you to consider it, he said. I'm asking whether it's something you'd think about. She was quiet for a moment. She felt the pull of it, not the desperation that might have felt like relief, but something steadier and more complicated, the kind of pull that came from wanting something and also being afraid of wanting it wrong. I need to be honest with you, she said. I'd rather you were. I don't know if what I feel is I don't know how to separate the real thing from the fact that you're the first person who helped me when I had nothing, and your children are two of the only people in this town who made me feel like I was already here, not just arriving. She looked at him directly. I don't want to say yes to you because I'm tired of being alone. You deserve better than that. Nathan was quiet for a moment. I know the difference, he said, between someone choosing me because I'm a better option than nothing, and the other thing. His voice was careful, controlled. Eleanor didn't marry me because she had nowhere else to go. She married me because she wanted to. I know what that feels like, and I know what the other thing feels like too. I've had enough people in my life be kind to me because they needed something. He paused. This isn't me pressing you. This is me telling you that you're allowed to take as long as you need to know your own mind. I'm not going anywhere. Clara absorbed this. The wind moved outside. A log shifted in the stove. I need to think, she said. I know. And I need to not let your children factor into it, which is difficult because they do. They're part of it, Nathan said. I'm not going to pretend they aren't, but they're not the thing. You know that. She did know that. That was part of what made it complicated, that she knew it, and knowing it didn't make the decision simple. It just made it honest. I need some time, she said. You have it. Duh. She walked back to town that evening without the wagon. She'd told Pete she wanted to walk, and the road was clear enough, and she needed the cold and the space and the physical movement to think. She was halfway to town when she heard a horse behind her and turned to find Nathan coming up the road at a walk. You don't have to, she started. It's 6 miles and it's getting dark, he said. Ride or walk beside, your choice, but I'm not going back until I know you got close enough to town that it's fine. She considered arguing and decided it was a waste of energy. She walked. He rode alongside at the pace she set, and they didn't say much, just the sound of her boots on the frozen road and the horses breathing and the cold sky overhead going from dark blue to black. Mar asked me today if I was going to stay in Red Hollow, she said after a while. What did you tell her? I said I was planning on it. He was quiet for a moment. Good answer. She said good and walked away. She doesn't waste words. She never has. He paused. She's happier than she was 6 months ago, measurably. I can see it. He said it simply, without pressure, just as an observation he was putting into the air between them. Clara looked at the road ahead. I know, she said. I can see it too. The lights of town appeared ahead, orange and distant through the dark. Caleb Mercer asked me to dinner, she said. Nathan's horse missed a step, then righted. He didn't say anything for a moment. Formally? He asked. He stopped me on the street yesterday, said he admired how I'd established myself, said he'd like to take me to supper at the hotel restaurant. She kept her voice level. I think he has a clearer idea of what he wants than he let on in the office. What did you say? I said I'd think about it. She glanced up at him. I'm telling you because you should know. I'm not telling you to make you feel something. I'm telling you because you've been honest with me and you deserve the same. Nathan looked at the road ahead, his face in profile, controlled. He can give you things I can't, he said finally. Money, position, a house in town if you wanted it. No ranch to manage, no children that aren't yours, no risk. He said each thing flatly, like he was laying out an accounting. I'm not saying this to talk you into anything. I'm saying it because you should have the whole picture before you decide. I know what he can give me, Clara said. I know you do. They walked in silence for a moment. The question, Clara said, is not what either of you can give me. The question is what I want. Yeah, Nathan said. That's the question. She stopped walking. He stopped the horse. They stood there on the dark road with the town lights ahead and the mountains behind, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because the moment was doing its own work. Good night, Nathan, she said. Good night, Clara. She walked the rest of the way into town alone, and she didn't look back, but she could hear the horse standing still on the road behind her for a good while before she heard it turn and head back toward the ranch. And she walked through the dark streets of Red Hollow and let both of the things she was feeling exist at the same time, the fear and the wanting and the uncertainty. And she told herself that was fine. that you didn't always have to resolve something before you could carry it, that some questions needed to sit in you for a while before they showed you their answer. She went upstairs to her narrow room above Mrs. Garland's house, and she sat at the small table and looked at the cold north-facing window, and she thought about what she wanted. Not what was safe, not what was smart, not what made sense on paper, but what she actually wanted, down in the part of her that had stopped lying to itself somewhere between Kansas City and Red Hollow, on a train ride toward a future that turned out to be something completely different from the one she'd been heading for. And she thought about a garden on the east side of a ranch house, enclosed by a low fence, full of dried and tangled things that had not been tended in 2 years, but had not, as she'd told Nathan, been ruined. A cage was still a cage, even with good locks and warm rooms. She knew that. She had always known that. The question was whether she was brave enough to choose the thing she actually wanted, instead of the thing she could rationally defend. She sat with that question for a long time, and the wind moved outside, and the board near the door creaked in the draft, and the town of Red Hollow settled into its winter night all around her, indifferent and steady and slowly, incrementally, becoming something that felt like hers. She took Mercer's supper invitation 3 days after Nathan's proposal, not because she had decided anything, but because Ada was right. You needed to know what something was before you could decide what to do about it. The hotel restaurant was the nicest room in Red Hollow, which was not saying a tremendous amount, but it was warm and the tablecloths were clean, and the lamp on each table gave everything an amber quality that was kinder than daylight. Mercer was already there when she arrived, standing at the table, and he pulled her chair out with the automatic ease of someone for whom good manners were not effort, but habit. He ordered for them both, which she noted and chose not to address, because it was the kind of thing that revealed character without requiring comment. The food was good, better than she cooked for herself, though that was not a high bar, and Mercer was an accomplished conversationalist in the way of someone who had spent a long time being interesting to people he needed things from. He asked about Kansas City, about the boarding house, about what she'd done there. He listened well, or performed listening well. She couldn't entirely tell which. He asked about her plans, using the word plans the way people did when they believed the person they were asking didn't really have any. "I'm still at the laundry," she said. "Ada's been good to me." "Ada Whitfield is a hard woman," Mercer said. Not unkindly. "She's made something out of nothing, which I respect. But it's a limited ceiling. You've been there 3 months, and you've already hit the edges of what that job can give you." "I'm also learning the town," Clara said. "That has its own value." "True." He turned his wine glass by the stem. "I want to be direct with you, Miss Whitmore. I think you've figured out that this invitation is not entirely about the laundry account." I gathered. "I've been in Red Hollow 8 years. I've built something here, not a ranch, not a physical thing. Something more like a position." He said it without vanity, as a plain statement of fact. "I've been considering for some time that what I've built would benefit from a partner. Not a business partner, a personal one." He looked at her steadily. "I think you're someone with the intelligence and the steadiness to be part of something like that. I think you're being wasted on laundry." "What would I not be wasted on?" Clara asked. "Running a household well, managing the social obligations that come with a position in this town, having a life with some stability in it." He paused. "I'm not proposing marriage tonight. I'm not that presumptuous. I'm saying that I'd like to spend more time with you, and that I want to be honest about what I see as the potential in that." Clara looked at him. He was a composed, intelligent man who knew what he wanted and was used to finding clear paths toward it. She could see why the town considered him an excellent prospect. She could see the life he was describing, ordered, comfortable, socially situated, free from the particular grinding anxiety of not knowing whether next week's wages would cover next week's rent. She could see herself in that life. She could not feel herself in it. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "But?" "I didn't say but." "Your face did," he said, not harshly, almost amused. Clara looked at the table for a moment and then decided that she owed him the same honesty he'd offered her. "I'm considering another situation," she said. "I haven't decided, but you should know." Mercer was quiet for a moment. His expression didn't change much, just a slight compression, a recalibration. "Carter," he said. She didn't confirm or deny it. "He's a decent man," Mercer said. I don't have a bad word for him. He's stubborn, and he's land poor, and he has 2 young children and a ranch that's had 2 difficult years and may have more. He said it without malice, measuring out facts. It's a harder life than what I'm offering. I know that. I'm not telling you anything you haven't thought of yourself. He picked up his wine glass. I'll simply say this. My offer of supper stands, and my offer regarding the land stands, and whatever you decide about the other matter, neither of those things changes. He looked at her. I like you, Miss Whitmore. I like how you think. I'd rather have you as a neighbor than lose you from the conversation entirely. It was, she thought, the most gracious way she had ever been told she was being outmaneuvered, because that was what it was. He was keeping the door open, keeping his position fluid, not committing to a loss, which was, she supposed, consistent with everything she knew about him. She went home that night and sat at her table and wrote 2 lists on separate pieces of paper, and then she looked at them for a while, and then she folded them both and put them in the bottom of her bag and did not look at them again. The lists were not the answer. She had known that before she wrote them. Christmas came and the town made its modest gestures toward the season. Pine boughs, a few colored papers in the shop windows, the sound of something that might have been singing from the direction of the schoolhouse one evening. Clara spent Christmas Eve at Ruth Calloway's sewing circle gathering, which had expanded for the occasion, and now included 11 women around a longer table with something warm to drink and a particular loosening of the usual conversational caution. Ruth's neighbor, Margaret, a woman in her 60s who had strong opinions about everything and expressed them without asking whether they were wanted, looked at Clara across the table and said, I hear you had supper with Caleb Mercer. I did, Clara said, and I hear Nathan Carter's been driving you home from the ranch on Saturday evenings. He has. Well, Margaret said in the tone of a woman who had formed a conclusion and was stating it for the room. That's an interesting situation. Is it? Clara kept her voice pleasant. 2 men in a town this size is always interesting, Margaret said, particularly when one of them has money and one of them has children. Ruth intervened with the firm redirection of a hostess who had spent 40 years managing conversations that were heading somewhere she didn't want them to go. Margaret, let the woman have her coffee in peace. I'm not being unkind, Margaret said. I'm being observant. There's a difference between the two, Ruth said, that you've spent 64 years failing to locate. There was scattered laughter. Margaret looked unrepentant. Clara drank her coffee and said nothing, which she had learned was the most effective response to that particular type of attention. Not silence that seemed wounded, but silence that seemed untroubled, which was a different thing entirely, and much harder to push against. Ada leaned over from the chair beside her and said very quietly, Don't mind Margaret. She's been narrating other people's lives since 1851, and she's got no plans to stop. She's not wrong that it's an interesting situation, Claire said, equally quiet. No, Ada agreed. She's just wrong to think it's her business. She paused. What are you going to do? I'm going to figure out what I want and then do that. Ada looked at her for a moment. Good answer, she said, which was what Nathan had said about a different answer 2 weeks earlier, and the parallel landed in Clara with a small, specific weight. The decision came on a Thursday in early January. Not in a dramatic way, not at a moment she had set aside for it. It came the way real decisions usually came, not as a bolt from somewhere outside herself, but as a recognition of something that had already been true for a while, surfacing finally because she'd stopped arguing with it. She was at the laundry, alone. Ada had gone to collect payment from the hotel and left Clara managing the front. And it was mid-morning, cold enough that the steam from the wash water fogged the windows, and she was working through a pile of ranch shirts and thinking about nothing in particular when Mara Carter walked in. Alone, which was startling enough that Clara set down what she was doing. Mara, how did you get to town? Pete had to come for supplies, Mara said. I asked him to stop here. I told him I needed to talk to you. She said this with the composed certainty of a child who had decided something and organized the logistics accordingly. Clara came around the counter and crouched down to Mara's level. What did you need to talk to me about? Mara looked at her with those watchful, Nathan-colored eyes. She had her coat buttoned wrong. One button off, the whole front skewed. and her braid was looser than usual, done by her own hand or Eli's. I heard my dad talking to Pete, Mara said. He didn't know I was listening. He said he asked you something important, and he was waiting for your answer. She looked at Clara with a directness that was almost uncomfortable. Are you going to say no? Clara was quiet for a moment. Where did you hear this? In the barn. I was with Marble. Mara reached out and straightened the collar of Clara's apron, a small, unconscious gesture of tidying. If you say no, that's all right. I just want to know so I know. She looked up. Eli says you're going to say yes. I told him he doesn't know that. Eli told you? Eli tells me everything. He can't keep things. She said it without irritation, the straightforward assessment of a younger sibling who had calibrated her expectations accordingly. He said you braided my hair and that means you're going to stay. That's not necessarily what it means. I know. Mara was quiet for a moment. I know you might go somewhere else. I know you might choose the man in town with the nice office. Eli says he's boring. I don't know. I've never met him. She looked at her buttons and began to correct them, working from the bottom up with patient concentration. I just wanted to tell you that if you say yes, I'm not going to be strange about it, about you not being my mother. I know you're not my mother. I think you're a good person to have. Clara sat down on the step beside the counter, which brought her to Mara's level without requiring the child to keep looking up. She felt the thing Mara had said moving through her. I think you're a good person to have, said with the plainness of a child who hadn't yet learned to dress feelings up before presenting them. Your mother was Eleanor, Clara said. Yes. I'm not going to try to be her. I know, Mara said. She had finished fixing the buttons and looked at Clara with that open, careful expression. She was different from you. She laughed louder. She sang when she worked, even when she was bad at it. Something moved across the girl's face, a ripple of memory. She was good. I'm sure she was. You're different good, Mara said. You're more quiet, but you pay attention. She looked at Clara steadily. She paid attention too, just differently. Clara looked at this 6-year-old girl who had been watching the people around her so carefully for so long that she could make that distinction, different good, different kinds of paying attention, and she felt something in her chest that was not grief exactly, and not joy exactly, but something large and patient that lived between the two. I'm going to give your father my answer tomorrow, Clara said. Mara blinked. What is it? I'll tell him first. Mara considered this. Then she nodded, the decisive single nod that meant she had accepted terms. She fixed the last button, which had been in the wrong hole the whole time, and stood up straighter. Pete's at the general store, she said. I have to go back. I'll walk you. They walked the half-block to the general store, Clara and Mara side by side on the wooden sidewalk in the January cold, and Pete was at his wagon with a load of supplies and looked at Clara with the non-committal acknowledgement he gave everyone and everything. She found you all right, he said. She did. Clara looked at Mara. Tell your father I'll be out Saturday. Mara climbed up onto the wagon seat with the practiced competence of a ranch child and arranged her coat and looked down at Clara from the higher position with an expression that was almost exactly her father's, contained, and underneath it something that was working very hard to stay contained. Saturday, Mara said, and Pete clicked to the horses and they pulled away. Well, Clara went back to the laundry and worked through the rest of the pile and thought about what Mara had said. Different good. And she thought about Nathan at the table with his coffee and his careful, honest words. And she thought about Mercer and his ordered office and his patient, accumulating certainty. And she thought about what she had written on those 2 pieces of paper and folded and put at the bottom of her bag. She thought about James, who had not been practical but had been decent, who had bought land he couldn't afford because he believed in the future of the place, who had died before he saw whether he was right. She thought about the garden. When Ada came back from the hotel, Clara was still working, and Ada looked at the size of the finished pile and raised an eyebrow. Productive morning, Ada said. I made a decision, Clara said. Ada looked at her. About? Nathan Carter. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had formed her opinion some time ago and was simply now being confirmed in it. Good. He's needed someone with a level head out at that ranch since Eleanor died. She hung up her coat. What about Mercer? I'll speak to him. He'll be fine, Ada said. Men like Mercer are always fine. That's the thing about them. She tied on her apron. What about the land? I'm going to claim it, Claire said. I'm going to service the debt, and I'm going to wait and see about the railroad. Ada looked at her for a long measuring moment. Then she nodded, the way people nodded when something aligned with what they'd expected, but were still satisfied to see. You'll need to tell Crane at the land office this week, Ada said, before Mercer tries another angle. I know. And you'll need to keep working here while you sort out the finances. I know that too. All right, Ada said, and got back to work. She went to the land office that afternoon. Crane looked at her over his chain glasses with the expression of someone who had not expected this development but was professionally obligated not to show that. You're claiming the Whitmore parcel, he said. I am. I'm next of kin, which establishes my right. I'll begin servicing the debt on both notes starting this month. Starting with what funds? My wages. It'll take time, but I'll meet the payments. Crane looked at her for a moment. Miss Whitmore, I told you the land is worth less than the debt. You told me in its current state, she said. I intend to change its current state. He took out a form and filled it in with the scratching efficiency of a bureaucrat who had decided his job was to process decisions, not evaluate them. You'll need to register the claim within 10 days. Bring proof of identity and the documentation on your brother's original purchase. I have the letter he sent me. Is that sufficient? Bring it and we'll see. He slid the form across the desk. Sign here. She signed. Walking out of the land office with the copy of the form in her hand, Clara felt something she had not felt since she'd stepped off the train in September. Not hope exactly, because hope was too fragile a word for it, and not certainty, because she was not certain. It was more like intention, the specific grounded feeling of having pointed herself in a direction and meaning it. Así. She went to see Mercer the next morning. He was at his desk when she came in, and he read her face before she said a word, because he was good at reading faces. You've made a decision, he said. 2 of them. She sat down without being asked, as she had the first time. I'm claiming my brother's land. I've registered at the land office. I'm going to service the debt and hold the parcel. He absorbed this without visible reaction. And the other decision? I'm going to accept Nathan Carter's proposal. Mercer was quiet for a moment. He turned his pen in his fingers twice, a small, habitual movement. I see, he said. Then, can I ask why? Clara considered the question. Because I want to, she said, which sounds simple, but it's the only reason I trust. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not wounded, not angry, but something that was more honest than anything he'd shown her across a supper table. A genuine surprise, possibly. Or something like respect that had lost the professional gloss. The land, he said finally. You should know the survey results are expected in the spring. Whether the spur comes through this corridor or the other one, you'll know by April. I know. If it doesn't come through, you'll have debt on land worth less than the debt. I know that too. And you're still claiming it. It was my brother's, Clara said simply. He believed in it. That's worth something. Mercer set the pen down. Miss Whitmore, he said. For what it's worth? Nathan Carter is a lucky man. I hope he knows that. I'll tell him you said so, Clara said, and stood up. Please don't, Mercer said, and she caught the edge of something almost like humor in it, and she nodded once and left. Well, Saturday came cold and clear, the January sky, the particular deep blue that Mara had called the sky. Getting dark before it's dark, and Pete brought the wagon at 11:30, as he always did, and the ride out to the ranch was quiet and bright, and the mountains to the west had snow on them that caught the light. Nathan was not in the barn this time. He was on the porch. He had been waiting, she realized. He was not someone who waited on porches. She had been out here a dozen Saturdays, and she had never seen him simply standing on the porch waiting. He had always been working. This time he was just standing, and when the wagon came into the yard, he came down the steps and helped her down before Pete had brought the horses to a full stop. He didn't say anything. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the question was right there in his face. Not demanding, not anxious, just present the way he was. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Not the held breath kind of quiet, but the kind that came from feeling something fully before you said anything about it. "You're sure?" he said. Not a question, really. "I'm sure," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else to go. Not because of the children, though they're in it." She looked at him directly. "Because of the small things. Because you told me about Eleanor's garden, not as a sad story, but as proof that something could survive. Because you let me pay back a loan you never expected to see. Because you said you'd wait, and you actually waited." He looked at her for a moment. Then he put one hand on her arm, not pulling her anywhere, just contact, the careful, deliberate kind. And he said quietly, "I meant everything I said." "I know," she said. "That's why I said yes." Eli appeared from around the side of the house at a dead run and then skidded to a stop when he saw the two of them standing in the yard. And he looked at their faces and arrived at his conclusion with the instantaneous confidence of a child whose instincts had been proved correct. "I knew it," he said. "You didn't know anything," Nathan said. "I told Mara." "Where is Mara?" Claire asked. "Inside. She said she wasn't going to come out until—" Eli stopped. "She made me promise not to tell her version." Clara looked toward the house. Through the kitchen window she could see the small shape of Mara, standing close to the glass, watching the yard. Clara raised her hand. Mara pressed her palm flat against the inside of the window. Then she turned and disappeared from the glass, and 30 seconds later the front door opened and she came out onto the porch with the measured dignity she brought to important occasions, walked down the steps, crossed the yard, and stopped in front of Clara. "Saturday?" she said, which was all she said. The single word that meant, "I told you you would come back." "Saturday," Clara agreed. Mara stepped forward and took Clara's hand, the practical grip of a child who had decided this was where she was going to stand, and she held it without theatrics. And Nathan looked at his daughter and at Clara and at his son, who was already talking again about something related to marble. And the look on his face was not joy in the uncomplicated sense. It was more complicated than that, layered with the particular mixture of relief and grief and gratitude that belonged to someone who had lost something and not expected to be given back anything like it, and then was. The weeks that followed were not simple. They were not supposed to be, and Claire had not expected them to be, and the fact that she hadn't was one of the reasons she got through them without falling apart. The town had opinions. Margaret had them loudest and earliest, which was consistent with her history. The consensus that emerged from the various conversations in various parlors and general store corners and laundry waiting rooms was not disapproval exactly. Nathan Carter was a known and respected figure, and Clara had established herself sufficiently that she was no longer a pure unknown, but it was watchful. People waited to see whether she would manage it, and they were not subtle about their waiting. She managed it the same way she managed everything else, by showing up and doing the work, and not making the mistake of caring more about the watching than the doing. Ada promoted her to a small partnership arrangement at the laundry. Not formal ownership, but a share of the profits on the accounts Clara had brought in herself. It was Ada's version of a wedding present, delivered without sentiment, framed as a business decision. "You'll have more obligations on your time when you're at the ranch," Ada said. "This makes sure you've got an income that's yours and not contingent on anything else. That matters." "It matters a lot," Clara said. "Don't thank me," Ada said. "It's practical." "It's both," Clara said, and Ada looked briefly at the ceiling as though requesting patience from the plaster, which was her version of being moved. Nathan came to town twice during January for what Clara recognized as the specific purpose of being seen with her. Not an announcement exactly, but a presence. They walked down Main Street on a Thursday afternoon, and Nathan stopped to talk to Hatch about a supply order, and Clara stood beside him and was introduced not as the woman from the hotel, not as Ada's girl at the laundry, but by her name, the way people were introduced when they were real and permanent and not going anywhere. Hatch looked at her with a new kind of attention, recalibrating, the way people did when someone stepped from one category into another, and said, "Miss Whitmore, good to have you in the community proper." It was a small thing. She told herself it was a small thing. But her chest did something when he said it that she had to quietly manage all the way back down the street. Nathan noticed. He said nothing until they were outside the general store, and then he said very quietly, Hatch called Eleanor Nathan's wife for 4 years. I know, Claire said. You told me. He called you by your name on the first try. She looked at him sideways. He probably practiced. Nathan almost laughed. It was the closest she had heard him come to it, a short exhale that was shaped like laughter, even if it wasn't quite. And it surprised both of them a little. Maybe he did, he said. Bet ici? She went to the garden in February. It was Nathan's idea, or rather, it was his suggestion and her instinct made into a plan. They went out to the east side of the house on a Saturday afternoon while the children were with Pete and his wife, and they stood at the fence and looked at what February had left of it. The skeletal remains of plants, the hard ground, the corner where the lavender had been that was now just brown earth. If we start clearing it in March, Clara said, we could be ready to plant by April. What would you plant? Nathan asked. She had thought about this. Things that are useful first, beans, tomatoes, squash, herbs along the south edge, not lavender right away. It takes time to establish, and I don't want to rush it. She looked at the corner. Lavender, when it's right. Eleanor would have had opinions about that, Nathan said. I know. Clara looked at the plot. I'm not planning it the way she did. I'm planning it the way I do. I need it to be all right that those are different things. It's all right, Nathan said. He said it simply, without ceremony, and she believed him. She looked at the ground for a moment. The soil was cold and hard, and the weeds had made themselves at home over 2 years, and there was a significant amount of work between standing at the fence and having anything grow. That was the truth of it. James was going to grow things on his land, she said. He wrote to me about it. He had a whole list. What was on the list? Corn. He wanted corn. He said he'd seen the soil, and it looked right for it. She paused. I'm going to put corn on his parcel this spring. I don't know enough about it yet, but I'm going to learn. Nathan looked at her. That's ambitious for a first year on dry farmed land. I know. Pete knows dryland farming. He grew up doing it in Kansas. He can help you figure out what's realistic. I'll ask him, she said. She looked at the garden and at the sky and at the ranch spreading out around them. The barns, the bunkhouse, the land going toward the mountains, the particular quality of February light that was starting, just barely, to hint that it would eventually become something else. I have a lot to learn. So do I, Nathan said, which surprised her. She looked at him. About what? He looked at the garden instead of at her, the way he did when he was going to say something that took more effort than most things. About how to be this again, he said. It's been 2 years of managing, of keeping things running and keeping the children fed and keeping the ranch from falling apart. I've lost the habit of something. He stopped. Of what? She asked, because she thought he needed to finish saying it. Of caring about something and not being afraid of what happens if you lose it, he said. You stop being afraid if you also stop, if you just make yourself not care as much. He looked at the ground. It's easier to manage a ranch than a life. A ranch has concrete problems. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know. I know you know, he said. That's part of why. You know what it costs to hold on to things, and you do it anyway. He stopped again. Then simply, I'm going to try. So am I, she said. We can both be bad at it for a while. This time he did laugh. A real one, short and unguarded. The kind she suspected he didn't produce very often. And it changed his face entirely for those 2 seconds, and she thought, there it is, and stored it. They went back inside, and Eli and Mara were back from Pete's, and Mara had gotten something in her hair that might have been barn straw, and Eli had a scrape on his left hand that he was being elaborately casual about. And Nathan looked at both of them and said, What happened? In the tone of a father who has asked this question many times before and has learned to brace himself for the answer. And Clara went to the kitchen to start on supper and listen to the story unfold. Eli's version, fast and strategic, Mara's corrections arriving at precisely the moments they were most needed. And she stood at the kitchen counter and felt the weight of the household around her, The noise and the cold and the barn smell and the children's voices and the sound of Nathan's long-suffering patience, and she felt it the same way she had felt the intention when she signed the form at the land office, like something pointed in a direction and meaning it. The supper came together the way suppers did when you knew a kitchen. Not perfectly, because the biscuits were a little flat, and she'd oversalted the broth and had to compensate. But it was food, and it was warm, and the four of them sat down together in the kitchen with the lamp turned up against the February dark. And Eli talked about the horse, and Mara corrected him. And Nathan caught Clara's eye across the table with an expression that was so plain and direct and undefended that she had to look down at her plate for a moment and do something quiet with what she felt. After supper, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was cleaned up, Nathan came and stood in the doorway while Clara was hanging the dish towel, and he said, "Thank you." "For supper?" "For—" He made a small gesture encompassing the room, the house, the evening. "For all of it." Clara looked at him. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I oversalted the broth." "I know," he said. "I didn't say it was perfect. I said thank you." She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had handed her a loan she hadn't asked for and called it practical and waited 4 months for her to figure out what she wanted, and she thought, not perfect, better than perfect, real. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it the same way she'd meant everything she'd said to him, simply and all the way down. They married on a Thursday in late February, which was not the most romantic day of the week and not the most romantic month. But it was the day the circuit judge came through Red Hollow, and Nathan had decided that waiting for a more picturesque occasion was the kind of thinking that had kept him from doing things he should have done sooner, and Clara agreed with him. The ceremony was in the front room of the courthouse, which smelled like old paper and wood smoke and was decorated with nothing, because neither of them had requested decoration, and the judge was not the kind of man who decorated without being asked. Ruth Calloway came, because Ruth had attached herself to the situation with the calm authority of a woman who had decided she was involved whether anyone had invited her or not. Ada came, with the expression she wore when she was moved and was managing it by being more brisk than usual. Pete stood in the back with his hat in both hands and his sunburned neck and said nothing, which was his version of a full emotional commitment to the occasion. Eli stood beside his father in a shirt that had been pressed so aggressively by Pete's wife Dora that it appeared almost structural. He kept his hands at his sides with the determined formality of someone performing a role he had taken seriously for weeks, and he only broke composure once, when the judge asked if there were any objections, and Eli said, under his breath but not far enough under it, "There better not be," which caused Ada to make a sound that she immediately converted into a cough. Mara stood beside Clara. She was wearing the blue ribbon. She had put it in herself that morning, the bow slightly imperfect the way it always was when she did it alone, and when Clara had offered to fix it, Mara had said, "It's fine," with a composure that meant it was not fine at all, but that she needed to have done it herself. And Clara understood that completely and left it alone. When the judge pronounced them married, Mara reached up and took Clara's hand without looking at her. She just reached up and took it, the same practical grip she'd used in the yard in January, and she held it while the adults exchanged the few words that needed to be exchanged and signed the paper that needed to be signed, and Clara held on back. And neither of them made anything of it, because they didn't need to. Afterward, Ruth had organized a meal at her house. She had done this without asking anyone's permission, which was consistent with her character. And there were 12 people around her table who ate roast chicken and biscuits and talked about everything except the wedding, because in a town the size of Red Hollow, the wedding had already been discussed at length in advance by everyone present, and the actual event was almost beside the point. Margaret, seated across the table, looked at Clara with an expression that was as close to approval as Margaret's face had ever managed. "You lasted," she said. "I did," Clara said. "I didn't think you would. When you arrived in September, I thought you'd be gone by November." "I know," Clara said. "Most of the town thought that." "Most of the town was wrong." Margaret said it the way someone said something they found mildly irritating even when it vindicated them, which was, Clara had come to understand, simply how Margaret experienced being wrong. "You'll do fine out at that ranch. Nathan needs someone with a spine." "He has a spine of his own," Clara said. "2 spines are better than 1, Margaret said, and turned to the woman beside her to discuss something else entirely, which was the full extent of Margaret's wedding toast. Bishibisti papas. Boikit. The house became hers in the incremental way that houses did. Not all at once, but in a series of small claims, each one almost imperceptible on its own. The corner of the kitchen counter where she kept the things she reached for most. The hook near the back door where she hung her working coat. The particular order of the shelves in the larder, which she rearranged once in March, and rearranged again 2 weeks later when she found a better system. And Nathan looked at both versions and said nothing because he had apparently decided that the larder was now her jurisdiction and he was going to treat it accordingly. She did not move things that were Eleanor's. That was a line she had thought about carefully and early. Eleanor's quilt was on the chest at the foot of the bed in the room Nathan had shared with her. Clara left it there. The small painted box on the kitchen windowsill that held nothing in particular but had clearly been placed there by someone who liked the way it looked in the light. Clara left that too. She was not trying to erase the woman who had made this place what it was. She was trying to add to it, which was a different kind of work, and one that required her to be honest about the difference. Nathan noticed. He noticed most things she was learning, but said less than half of what he noticed, which meant that when he did say something, she knew it had waited its turn. "You left the box," he said one evening, looking at the kitchen windowsill. "It belongs there," Clara said. He looked at it for a moment. Eleanor found it at a trader's cart in 1878. She said she bought it because the color was right. He paused. "I don't know what color she meant. It looks brown to me." "It's more of a dark amber," Clara said. "In the afternoon light it goes almost gold." Nathan looked at it again. "Huh," he said. And that was all, but something in his face had settled in a way she was coming to recognize. The specific expression of someone finding out that the thing they thought they'd lost had not been entirely lost, but had just been waiting for someone to see it from a slightly different angle. March came in cold and then softened by the middle of the month, the way Colorado Springs did. Grudging at first, then abrupt, as if the season had been holding back and then simply gave up resisting. The ground around the ranch unfroze unevenly, the south-facing slopes first, the low places around the barns last. Clara started on the garden. She had talked to Pete's wife Dora about plants, and to Ruth, who had kept a kitchen garden for 40 years, and she had read a pamphlet that Hatch had ordered from Denver that she'd found in the back of the general store under a stack of seed catalogs. She was not starting with expertise. She was starting with information and willingness, which she had come to believe were actually the more important combination. The clearing took 2 full weekends and parts of 3 evenings during the week. Nathan helped when he could, which was not as often as he would have liked. March was fence-mending time on the ranch, and the east pasture had taken particular damage over the winter. Eli helped on the first Saturday with the specific, exhaustible enthusiasm of a 9-year-old, genuinely useful for about 2 hours, and then spent, though he remained in the garden area expressing opinions about the work for another hour after his body had stopped cooperating. Mara helped differently. She didn't work in bursts. She came out and crouched at the edge of the cleared plot and looked at the soil the way she looked at most things, with patient, concentrated attention. And after a while she said, "The corner over there is darker." Clara looked. "It is. The drainage from the roof gutter runs that way. The soil's richer in that corner." "What should go there?" "Tomatoes, probably. They like it richer." Mara looked at the corner for a moment. "Can I plant something, my own thing?" "What do you want to plant?" Mara thought about it seriously for 2 full days, which Clara knew because she saw the thinking on the girl's face at meals and didn't interrupt it. On Monday evening, Mara appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, "Sunflowers. I want sunflowers in my corner, along the edge." "That corner gets good sun," Clara said. They do well there." "Mama grew sunflowers once," Mara said. "I don't remember it, but Eli said she did. He has better memory of her than I do." She said it without self-pity, just as an accounting. "I want to grow them because she did, but also because I want them. Both things." Clara looked at her. "Both things is fine," she said. "Both things is exactly right." They ordered sunflower seeds from Hatch's catalog the next day. The news about the railroad came in April, the way Mercer had said it would. Clara was at the laundry when Ada came in from the street with the expression she wore when she had information she was deciding how to present. "The survey results came in," Ada said. Clara set down the shirt she was working. "Which route?" The eastern corridor. Ada looked at her steadily. Through the parcel cluster. Clara was quiet for a moment. She felt the thing move through her. Not triumph, because triumph was too simple for what it was. More like a long exhale after holding her breath for 4 months. James's parcel, she said. Right in the path, Ada said. They'll want to purchase rights of way from landowners in the corridor. Mercer's going to do very well. She paused. So are you. Clara sat down on the stool behind the counter. She thought about Mercer in his office making her a reasonable offer in December, patient and composed and certain. She thought about James, who had bought land he couldn't afford in the belief that things would work out. She thought about what she had said to Mercer. He was decent, not practical. She had defended that. She had stood in that office and defended the value of her brother's decency. And now she sat in Ada's laundry and found out that the unpractical man had, in his impractical way, been right. He would have laughed, she said. Your brother? He would have laughed and then said something like, I told you. He was that kind of person. She looked at her hands. He never actually said I told you to anyone in his life, but he would have that one time. Ada sat down on the other stool, which she almost never did. Ada preferred to be in motion. What are you going to do? Talk to the railroad representative. Find out what they'll offer for right-of-way. Clara took a breath. The land is worth more now than the debt. Even if I sell the right-of-way and keep the parcel, I come out ahead. If I sell the parcel outright, I come out further ahead. What are you going to do with the money? Clara thought about Nathan's East 40 acres, the ones Mercer had tried to buy 2 years ago during the bad year. She thought about the fence line that needed work every spring. She thought about the bunkhouse roof that Pete had been patching rather than replacing for 3 years. The ranch needs things, she said simply. Ada looked at her for a moment. That's your brother's money. That's my money, Clara said. That came from my brother's land, that I held on to because he believed in it and I believed in him. She looked at Ada. I'm going to put it into the place where I live. That seems right. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the particular gruffness she used to cover things that moved her, He'd have liked that, I think. Your brother. Yes, Clara said. He would have. She told Nathan that evening. She told him plainly, the way she told him everything. At the kitchen table, with the lamp up, and the children in bed, and the house quiet around them. She told him what the survey result was, what it meant for the parcel, what she was thinking about doing with the proceeds. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. That's your money, he said. You don't have to put it into the ranch. I know I don't have to. I don't want you to feel like, Nathan, she looked at him. I know what I'm deciding. I'm not doing it because I feel obligated. I'm doing it because this is my home and I want it to be sound. She paused. I want the bunkhouse roof fixed properly. I want the east pasture fence rebuilt instead of patched. I want Pete to have what he needs to work without improvising everything. She looked at her hands. And I want to put lavender in the garden. Eleanor's lavender, along the south edge. She looked up. That's what I want to do with the money, if you'll let me. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. The lavender was her idea, he said. She ordered it from a catalog and grew it from seed. Took 2 years before it really established. His voice was level but not entirely steady. She used to cut it and put it in a jar on the windowsill next to that box. I know, Clara said gently. I figured. He looked at the window. The box sat in the dark now, the amber color invisible without the afternoon light. Yes, he said finally. Do what you want with the money. Do all of it. He paused. Thank you. Don't thank me, she said. It's my home. He looked at her when she said that, directly, the way he had looked at her in the yard the day she'd said yes, with everything showing and nothing armored, and he nodded once, the slow kind. Bet. She went to see Mercer 2 days later. He knew the survey results. Of course he knew. He had probably known before anyone else in town because that was who he was. When Clara came into his office, he stood up and said nothing, waiting, because he was a man who understood when the other person had something to say and that saying it was their right. I'm not selling the parcel, Clara said. He nodded slowly. The right of way? I'll negotiate with the railroad directly. I don't need a broker. I know you don't. He sat back down. He did not look like a man who had lost exactly. He looked like a man who had made a calculation that hadn't come out the way he'd hoped and was filing that information for future use, which was what men like Mercer did with loss. They organized it. For what it's worth, he said, you played it well. I held on, Clara said. That's not a strategy. That's stubbornness. In the right direction, Mercer said. Stubbornness in the right direction is most of what strategy is. He looked at her with the honest, unvarnished attention he'd shown her once or twice before, underneath the professional composure. You're going to be fine, Mrs. Carter. It was the first time anyone outside the ranch had called her that. It landed with a small, specific weight. I know, she said. She left his office for what turned out to be the last time, and she stood on the sidewalk outside with the April sun on her face. Real warmth now, not the thin winter kind, but actual warmth with the promise of something longer in it. And she thought about September, about the train platform and the leather bag, and $11.40, and a letter that described a future that no longer existed. She thought about sitting on those hotel steps in the afternoon sun while a small boy asked her why she looked like she'd lost everything. She had. She had lost everything she'd planned on, and she had built something else entirely. Not a replacement, not a consolation prize, something different, something she hadn't known to want until she was in the middle of wanting it, which was, she was coming to believe, the only way you ever found the things that were actually yours, not by planning for them. By surviving the wreckage of the plans you'd made and being honest about what you reached for in the clearing afterward. The railroad representative came to Red Hollow in May, a tidy man named Fellows who wore a good suit and shook hands efficiently and went through the landowners in the corridor with the systematic purpose of someone who had done this in many towns. Clara met with him at the courthouse, with Crane present to witness, and she negotiated with the calm directness of a woman who knew what her parcel was worth now and had no particular interest in accepting less than that. Fellows raised an eyebrow twice during the negotiation. Once when she pushed back on his first offer, and once when she pushed back on his second, and on the third offer, he looked at her with something approaching genuine interest. You've done this before, he said. No, she said. But I understand numbers and I know what I'm selling. He settled at a figure that was not everything she'd asked for but was more than he'd started with, which was how negotiations ended when both sides were serious, and Crane notarized the right-of-way agreement, and she walked out with a bank draft that was more money than she had ever held in her hands in her life. She stood on the courthouse steps and looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the bank, deposited most of it, and walked to the general store and ordered a bunkhouse roof's worth of shingles and a fence line's worth of posts and wire, and told Hatch to put it on the Carter account. And Hatch wrote it down without comment except to say, good quality wire or the cheaper kind? Good quality, Clara said. It'll hold longer. It will, Hatch agreed, and wrote it down. The garden came in that summer. Not all at once, not perfectly. The tomatoes in Mara's rich corner went in first and took hold cleanly. The beans struggled in June with a dry spell and then recovered in July when the rains came. The squash took over more space than Clara had allocated, and she let it, because the plants clearly had opinions and she had learned, in gardening as in most things, that there was a point at which you stopped directing and started accommodating. The lavender went in along the south edge in June, not from seed this time, but from starts that Clara had found through Ruth's contacts, already a year old, small but established. They would need another year before they really settled. That was all right. She was not in a hurry. Mara's sunflowers were the thing that summer. They came up in July along the corner of the garden fence, tall and ungainly and vivid, their faces tracking the sun through the day with the cheerful, mechanical reliability of plants that knew exactly what they were for. There were 11 of them. Mara had planted 15 seeds and lost 4 to a late frost, and could account precisely for each one because Mara accounted for things. She checked them every morning before breakfast. She brought a small tin cup of water to each one during the dry spell in June, which was more ceremonial than effective since the roots were deep enough by then that they didn't need supplemental watering. But Nathan did not tell her this because he understood that the ritual was the point. One afternoon in late July, Clara was working in the garden, and Mara came and stood at the fence watching, and after a while she said, "Eli says the sunflowers look like they're happy. What do you think?" Mara considered. "I think plants don't feel things that way, but I think they look the way happy looks, if that's different." "That might be the same thing," Clara said. Mara looked at the sunflowers for another moment. "Clara, I'm glad you stayed." Clara straightened up from the bean row and looked at her. Mara was looking at the sunflowers, not at her, which was Mara's way of saying important things, sideways, aimed at something neutral, leaving the words to carry the weight without the added pressure of direct eye contact. "I'm glad I stayed too," Clara said. Mara nodded, satisfied, and went back to the house. The bunkhouse roof was done by August, Pete supervising with the specific territorial investment of a man whose workspace was being improved and who had strong opinions about how it should be done. The fence line on the east pasture was replaced in September, post by post, Nathan and Pete working from the north end and Clara bringing water and lunch and occasionally holding a post while it was set, because the work was there and she didn't see a reason to stand on the porch watching what she could help with instead. Nathan said, one afternoon while they were working, "You don't have to do this." "I know. It's not your what—" "Nathan." And so she handed him the post she was holding. "I live here. It's my fence." He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the plain, undefended one, and then turned back to the post hole. Pete, on the other side of the fence line, said nothing, but his neck was an interesting color that might have involved emotion. The ranch was not transformed. That was not how things worked, and Clara had stopped expecting transformation a long time ago. The ranch was improved. The bunkhouse was sounder. The fences were better. The larder was organized in a way that made winter preparation more efficient. The household ran with a regularity it apparently hadn't had since Eleanor. But the cattle still had bad days. The weather still made decisions that no one had asked for. Pete still had to improvise solutions to problems that proper equipment would have prevented. The children still argued. Nathan still carried things quietly and had to be asked directly before he'd admit to them. Real life was not a series of resolved problems. It was the same problems, managed differently over time, with occasional new ones arriving to keep you honest. Clara had known this before she came to Red Hollow. She knew it more specifically now. What changed was not the difficulty. What changed was who was there when the difficult things happened. Eli turned 10 in October, and Clara made him a birthday cake with flour and patience and the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided to do something despite having burned the first attempt and run low on sugar. The cake was slightly lopsided. Eli looked at it with the expression of a child performing gratitude, located the genuine gratitude underneath the performance, and said, "It's good, even where it's different heights." "It tastes the same at all heights," Clara said. "That's what I mean," he said, and ate 2 pieces. Mara had 1 piece and declared it the best cake she had had in a long time, which Nathan pointed out was probably because the last cake they'd had was a year ago and Dora had made it, and it had been excellent. Mara looked at him with the specific withering patience of someone who understood perfectly well that they were making a valid comparison and had decided to feel it differently anyway. "It's the best cake I've had in a long time," she repeated, precisely. And that was that. Winter came again, the second one Clara spent in Red Hollow. The difference between this one and the last was not dramatic. The cold was the same. The mountains were the same. The particular quality of January light was the same clear, thin, almost colorless blue it had been the year before. But she sat at the kitchen table now, with Nathan's coffee on one side and Mara's arithmetic on the other, and the sound of Eli somewhere in the house being more noise than a single person had any right to produce, and it was not the same at all. One evening in January, almost exactly a year after the night she had walked home from the ranch along the dark road and listened to Nathan's horse standing still behind her, she sat on the porch in her coat because the night was clear enough and cold enough to make the stars extraordinary, and Nathan came out and stood beside her, and they looked at the sky for a while without talking. "I've been thinking about James's parcel," she said. "What about it?" "The right-of-way money is mostly into the ranch now. The debt is paid. The land is clear." She exhaled, watching the breath go. "I want to plant it. Spring, not just corn. I want to actually farm it. Even a partial planting to see what the soil does." Nathan was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of work on top of the ranch. I know, but Pete knows dryland farming, and he's been patient about teaching me things. And I think, she paused, I think James bought that land because he thought it was worth something, not just in money, in what it could do, in what could grow in it. She looked at the dark land beyond the ranch fence. I want to find out if he was right. He was right about the railroad corridor, Nathan said. He didn't know about the railroad, he just thought the land was good. Then maybe he was right about the land. Clara looked at the sky. The stars out here were nothing like Kansas City. They had nothing like this in Kansas City, this depth, this quantity, this sense of the sky being a genuine distance rather than a ceiling. She had gotten used to it over a year and was still not done being astonished by it. I miss him, she said. I didn't let myself do it properly for a long time. I was too busy surviving. I know what that's like, Nathan said. I know you do. They stood side by side in the cold for a while. A coyote called somewhere to the east, one long note and then silence. He wrote to me about the sky, she said. In the letter, he said there was more of it here than anywhere else he'd been. He said it made him feel like there was more room for things. She paused. He was right about that too. Sounds like he was right about a lot of things. He was right about the important ones, Clara said. He was just wrong about the timing. He thought he had more of it. Nathan reached over and took her hand, the unhurried, deliberate way he did things that mattered, and held it without saying anything, because sometimes the right thing was not a word but just a presence, just the warmth of another person next to you in the cold, letting you feel the weight of what you were carrying without trying to take it away. That was something Clara had not understood clearly when she was younger. That the best someone could do for your grief was not to fix it, or replace it, or talk you past it, but to stand next to you in it, to say, without words, this is real, and I'm not going anywhere while you feel it. She had learned this from a man who had done it himself, alone, for 2 years before she arrived, and she thought, standing in the January cold with his hand warm around hers, that there were worse teachers than someone who had gone ahead of you through the hard thing and came out the other side still standing, still trying, still capable of reaching out. Spring came again. The garden started earlier that year because Clara started it earlier, clearing the winter debris in March, while the ground was still cold enough to be uncomfortable to kneel on. The lavender along the south edge had survived the winter. She checked each plant with the slightly anxious attention of someone who has invested in something that has no guarantees, and they were still alive, small and gray-green, beginning the slow process of becoming the thing they were eventually going to be. Mara planted sunflowers again, more of them this time. She had saved seeds from the previous year's plants with the careful, systematic thoroughness that characterized everything she did. And she had 17 seeds in a folded paper in her coat pocket, and she planted each one herself in the corner she had claimed as hers, measuring the spacing with a piece of string. Same corner? Clara asked. Same corner, Mara said. It worked before. She said this with the confidence of someone who had developed a theory about a plot of Earth based on 1 year's data and was committed to the experiment. James's parcel was planted in May. Pete taught her the spacing and the soil preparation and the particular patience required for dryland corn, the kind that needed to have good root depth before the summer dry spells came, the kind that couldn't be coaxed with supplemental water because the water wasn't there, the kind that had to be the right variety for the altitude and the rainfall and the specific character of this particular piece of ground. They planted it on a Saturday, she and Pete and Nathan, and Eli insisted on helping and did so with genuine usefulness for most of the morning. Mara came at the end of the afternoon and walked between the rows that had been prepared but not yet covered, looking at the length of the field with a quiet expression. It's a lot of rows, she said. It's a lot of land, Clara said. Will it grow? We'll see, Clara said. We did what we could. The rest is the land's decision. Oh, Mara thought about this. That's the same as the sunflowers, she said. Most things that grow work the same way, Clara said. You do what you can, and you don't stop hoping for the rest. Mara looked at the rose for another moment, then at Clara. Eli says you're a farmer now, she said, as well as the other things. The other things? Clara looked at her. Wife? Mother? Mara said these words with the particular deliberateness of someone who has considered them and decided they are the right words. He says, "You're all the things at once." Clara was quiet for a moment. She had not pushed for mother. She had never used the word herself, never asked the children to use it, never created any expectation in that direction. She had been Clara, just Clara, and had understood that was the right thing to be, and had not let herself count on anything more. "Does that feel right to you?" she asked carefully. What Eli said? Mara considered the question with her usual seriousness. "You're not the same as mother," she said. "She was different, but you're not. You're not a mother either." She looked at the field. "I don't have a word that fits exactly. Eli just picks the closest one." "That's all right," Claire said. "The closest one is enough." Mara nodded as if that had been the answer she was checking for. Then she turned and walked back toward the ranch, and Clara watched her go. This girl, who had been so careful about trust, who had carried her loss with a gravity far older than 6 years, who had pressed her palm against the kitchen window in January and held Clara's hand through a ceremony in February and planted sunflowers in the same corner 2 springs running because it had worked before. Clara turned back to the field. The rows stretched out to the east, the prepared soil dark and even, the seeds in the ground not yet anything you could see but already, in the way that seeds were, committed to becoming something. James had believed this land was good. She was in the process of finding out. She was 44 days from being able to say whether he had been right, and she intended to be here to find out, and to be here the year after that regardless of what this year said, because that was how it worked. You showed up, you did what you could, you didn't stop hoping for the rest. She stood in the May afternoon on her brother's land with the Colorado sky above her and the mountains to the west, and the ranch behind her, and the sound of Eli's voice carrying across the distance from where he was inevitably doing something that would require explanation. And she felt the full weight of everything she was son, a woman who had arrived at a train platform with $11.40 and a future that had already closed, who had sat on hotel steps in the September sun and been asked by a 9-year-old boy why she looked like she'd lost everything. She had lost everything she'd planned on. She had not lost herself. And that, she understood now, was the thing she had been most afraid of. Not the poverty, not the isolation, not the town's indifference, or the unworkable debt, or any of the practical problems that had seemed so large in September. The thing she had feared underneath all of it was that losing enough would eventually cost her the ability to reach toward anything, the way a muscle could be used wrong for long enough that it forgot how to function. But you did not lose that by losing things. You lost it by stopping, by deciding the risk of reaching was greater than the cost of stillness, by choosing the cage because the cage was warm. Clara had sat on the hotel steps and chosen not to stop. She had worked in a laundry and repaid a debt in installments, and gone to a sewing circle and stood at a fence looking at a ruined garden and said the soil looked like it could still grow things. She had said yes when yes was not safe, but was true. She had claimed her brother's land when it made no financial sense and held it when it would have been easy to let go. And she had put lavender along the south edge of a garden that had been someone else's and was now partly hers, the way everything here was partly hers, built on what was already here, changed by being added to, neither erased nor unchanged. That was what a life was, in the end, not a clean start or a finished product, a continuation, an addition. The next row planted in ground that other hands had worked, and the ground made different by the planting, and the person made different by the ground. She had come to Red Hollow with nothing left. She had turned out to be wrong about that. She'd had herself. She'd had the stubbornness not to stop. She'd had a brother who believed in good land and a stranger who gave her a loan he didn't expect back, and a small boy who asked the right question on the right afternoon, and a girl who pressed her palm against glass and held her hand through the important moments without making them theatrical. These were not nothing. These were, in fact, everything. The wind moved across the field, and the mountains held their snow, and the sky did what the sky did out here. Went wide and deep and uncontainable, the way James had described it, more room for things, and she stood in it and breathed, and then she turned and walked back toward the ranch, toward the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, toward the sound of her family.